Chapter 1592. Luo Fan's final calculation result made him involuntarily reveal an inexplicable smile. According to his calculation, this world would give birth to creatures of the same race as the ones that Guei Shou had created in this civilized country. However, the density of these creatures would be thousands of times higher than what he had imagined. He had originally thought that such a race would be born in a region with a circumference of billions of miles. Then, they would continue to expand and develop. Finally, they would link up with each other and form a vast country that would occupy every inch of the world. Then, they would become the true protagonist of this world. However, according to his current calculation, such creatures would be born in a region that was more than 10 million miles away. Moreover, according to the calculation of this vitality, even if these living beings disappeared, even if they died, the world would very quickly recreate them if they continued to maintain this density. It seems that this world is extremely desperate for the appearance of this world's protagonist. This thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. Suddenly, an inexplicable feeling came from the void. This feeling was as if an indescribable will had descended here. This kind of will was faintly discernible, but it was vast and boundless, profound and unfathomable. It felt like if even a trace of it materialized, it would be enough to bring about an incomparably great threat to him and put his life in danger. "Who is it?" Luo Fan shouted softly. The strength of this will. It made him extremely shocked. He could not even imagine how powerful an existence with such a will must be. If someone told him that this will was the will of a true saint, he would definitely believe it without hesitation. Qing Yi's and Yu Ji's expressions changed slightly when they heard that soft shout. Their strength and perception were far inferior to Luo Fan's. Luo Fan could feel the existence of that faintly discernible strong will, but they could not feel it at all. To them, Luo Fan at this moment, it was as if he was overreacting and suddenly shouted such a sentence. However, obviously, although they felt that Luo Fan seemed to be overreacting, their rationality told them that their master, Luo Fan, definitely did not overreact. Given his reaction, there was definitely something that had appeared here. Something that was beyond his control had definitely appeared. That was the only reason why Luo Fan would have such an expression and reaction. Knowing this, how could they not be nervous? One had to know that compared to Luo Fan, they were really as weak as ants. Something that even Luo Fan had to deal with so nervously was even more difficult for them to control and deal with. Luo Fan shouted softly. It spread far and wide, directly penetrating into the void, almost to the endless distance. He believed that no matter where the owner of that will was, no matter how far away he was from here, he would definitely hear this shout. However, the will did not change in the slightest because of this. It was still faintly discernible in the surroundings. He was still observing him as if he was observing an ant. At this moment, Luo Fan did not even have the feeling that he was being seen through. This, of course, was not because this will was weaker than the flood dragon that gave him such a feeling, but because this will was many times stronger than the flood dragon's will. It was so strong that even Luo Fan himself could not feel what effect this will had on him. It was so strong that even if he felt the existence of this will, he could not detect its effect on him at all. Seeing that there was no response from this will, Luo Fan's heart moved. An unknown amount of power was guided down from that unknown place, directly turning into a concept of heaven and earth. It turned into a long robe that draped over his body, directly isolating him from everything in the outside world. At this moment, that will seem to be slightly separated because of this change. "Who is it?" Luo Fan's expression was still extremely ugly as he shouted again. However, what awaited him was still a period of silence. Luo Fan frowned and began to activate his wisdom. He thought frantically and searched frantically, trying to find the source of this will. He wanted to understand what kind of existence was emitting this will, and what exactly was that will thinking. It was a pity that the will was too profound and obscure. At this moment, Luo Fan could not find the truth of that will at all. It was as if he was really overreacting and there was no will at all. Just as Luo Fan was about to ask for the third time, an inexplicable change suddenly appeared. That faintly discernible and unfathomable wisdom suddenly increased by many times. In an instant, it produced an earth-shattering power that directly crushed him. The strength of this was almost the first time Luo Fan had seen such a strong since he stepped onto the path of cultivation. Not to mention the false saints and the desperate ones that he had seen before, even existences like the Gene Emperor seemed to be much weaker than this will. Under this will, Luo Fan felt that the conceptual world that appeared around his body could not withstand the pressure of that will immediately. With a loud bang, it had completely collapsed. Moreover, the countless concepts that had collapsed were once again crushed by that will and directly collapsed into nothingness. They simply disappeared without a trace. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if his soul was being hammered by a giant hammer and crushed crazily. Waves of inexplicable dizziness surged up. Even his life essence seemed to be rattling at this moment, as if it would completely collapse in the next moment and be directly annihilated. An unprecedented strong sense of life crisis surged up from the bottom of his heart. At this moment, he really felt that he was facing death. He really had the feeling that this moment was the last moment of his life. What a strong will. But it's still not a true sage. I'm still far from it. At this moment, what Luo Fan had was not the various kinds of fear and distracting thoughts that ordinary living beings would have when they were about to die. Instead, he had such a thought. Although this will was strong, terrifying, and had incredible power, it did not have the aura of a true sage. Although it felt several levels higher than the level that Luo Fan could reach now, it was still a level that he could see from afar. And this, obviously, it was not the performance that a true sage-level willpower should have. Just when Luo Fan thought that he was going to die in the next moment, that will suddenly shrank. It returned to its original, faintly discernible state. It was still that unfathomable and incomprehensible state, but it brought him a huge deterrent. And all the danger and pain that Luo Fan felt. It also disappeared completely in an instant. Is it going to say something? Luo Fan murmured. At this moment, that will turned, and almost without wasting any time, it had already swept past the living beings that he had sealed into mountains to protect this civilized country. As this will swept past, most of those living beings began to shake violently. Immediately after, the seal that Luo Fan had originally sealed them for eternity was broken. Those living beings looked up to the sky and howled, and their bodies directly rushed into the void. All of them looked at Luo Fan with a fierce gaze. With a glance, Luo Fan knew that these living beings were not others. They were the living beings of that big organization. And the remaining nearly half, which was a few hundred living beings, did not belong to this big organization. In other words, they were the living beings of other organizations that had invaded this area. At this moment, Luo Fan had a guess about the identity of the owner of that will. For the living beings of this big organization, they helped them escape. As for the living beings that do not belong to this organization, they don't care about them, and they are so powerful. Come to think of it, this should be the strongest person of this big organization, the unfathomable and mysterious leader. This thought flashed through his mind. The living beings of the big organization had been rescued, but this was not a good thing for Luo Fan. The most direct thing was that the array formation he had set up to protect the entire civilized country had been destroyed at this moment, and its power had been greatly reduced. If he wanted to continue using it, he would have to rearrange the remaining sealed living beings and rebuild the array formation. The next time we meet, I will definitely take revenge for today, the 9-headed, 13-armed living being said calmly. As he said that, he turned around and flew away with a cold expression. The other living beings also looked at Luo Fan with extremely ugly expressions, but none of them said anything harsh. They just turned around and left one by one. To these creatures, they needed the help of their leader in order to escape and ascend to the heavens. Only then could they be safe. This was simply too humiliating. Under such circumstances, how could they have the face to say anything harsh? Only the nine-headed, 13-armed being, who had suffered far too many losses, could not hold back the anger in his heart and speak such ruthless words. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled bitterly. If not for the faintly discernible powerful will that still existed and seemed to still be eyeing him covetously, how could he have let these living beings leave so easily? One had to know that at this moment, the strength of these living beings had been greatly reduced, and it was extremely easy to deal with them. Once they left the range of this civilized country, these living beings would be like fish in the sea or birds flying in the sky. The difficulty of dealing with them would increase by at least 100 times. Almost in the blink of an eye, those living beings had already disappeared from Luo Fan's sight and left the range of this civilized country. However, they had a tacit understanding. They each opened up their own nests not far away from this civilized country and stayed there. After suffering such a great loss, even if they did not say anything harsh, they could not swallow their anger at this moment. When all of these creatures left, that faintly discernible, yet incomparably powerful and boundless will that could even easily crush Luo Fan, making him feel as if his life would disappear in the next instant, also disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. After everything disappeared, Luo Fan let out a slight sigh. "Master, what happened just now?" Yuji asked carefully. Although she could not sense the existence of that will, she and Xing Yi had seen everything clearly. However, she and Xing Yi had clearly witnessed everything that had happened earlier. Naturally, they knew that there was definitely some sort of existence that had appeared here. Moreover, their master could not control it at all and could not resist it. How could she not be curious at this moment? When Luo Fan heard this, he shook his head and said, "A true expert will descend here and save those living beings." A true expert? Yuji cried out in surprise. For Yuji, there was no doubt that Luo Fan was powerful. His ability was enough to make people despair. His various, almost omnipotent means were already beyond her wildest dreams. But how could she accept the words "true expert" coming out of Luo Fan's mouth at this moment? Luo Fan sighed and said, "That's right. We are still too weak." After sighing, he shook his head and raised his hand. In an instant, the numerous sealed living beings that still existed in this civilized country in the form of mountains left the ground one by one and began to wander around this civilized country. The entire process was extremely mysterious and profound. Among them, the trajectory of each and every mountain peak contained an indescribable principle. It contained profound mysteries that could allow all living beings to soar into the heavens with a single leap. The hundreds of mountains wandered like this for dozens of breaths. After a slight pause, it descended and landed on the ground, creating an extremely mysterious formation in the civilized country. It directly produced an indescribable might, and it faintly connected with the entire civilized country. It strengthened the various aspects of this civilized nation by countless times. Of course, compared to before those living beings were rescued, the extent of this strengthening was obviously not as great as before. This was unavoidable. While Luo Fan was doing this, Xing Yi and Yuji, who were nearby, were a little stunned. At this moment, the two of them had countless doubts and questions to ask Luo Fan. However, when they saw that Luo Fan was completely uninterested in answering them, they could only forcefully hold back their questions. That feeling was indescribably unbearable. After he finished setting up the formation, Luo Fan lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure had already returned to the mountain peak, back to the palace that he had stayed in for an unknown period of time. Xing Yi and Yuji stayed there and looked at each other. They wanted to chase after him, but they knew that Luo Fan was not too willing to see them now. "What should we do now?" Yuji finally asked. "What else can we do?" "Continue to strengthen the world." Xing Yi sighed. After the two of them came to an agreement, they did not hesitate to take a step forward. Their figures crossed an unknown number of millions of miles and directly returned to one of the 30 million worlds that they had opened up. It was one of the worlds that had not been strengthened yet. Although the living beings that they had created had already lost in the war for the leading role of the world. However, this did not mean that all the worlds that they had opened up had been lost. In fact, it was the opposite. None of the 30 million worlds had been damaged, and it was still the same as before the war broke out. If there was anything different, it would be that the worlds that they had created living beings with born Taoism aptitude no longer had any living beings with born Taoism aptitude. The reason for this was very simple. Although they had opened up so many worlds and created so many living beings, not all living beings and all worlds were recognized by the world as part of the civilized country. The world only recognized living beings with born Taoism aptitude as part of the civilized country. In other words, they were only candidates for the leading role of the world. Because of this, the failure of the living beings that Qing, Yi, and Yuji had created in the fight for the leading role of the world only caused the living beings with born Taoism aptitude to completely disappear. It did not affect living beings that did not have born Taoism aptitude, nor did it affect the worlds that did not have born Taoism aptitude. That was the reason for the current situation. From this point of view, although living beings that did not have born Taoism aptitude had lost the opportunity to become the leading role of the world, it was also because of this that they had survived. Although living beings with born Taoism aptitude had a chance to soar into the sky and become the leading role of the world, it was also because of this that they had been completely wiped out at this time. It was difficult to tell which was luckier and which was better. After the battles that Qing, Yi, and Yuji had witnessed, they now had a very clear understanding of their own weakness. Although they were constantly strengthening those worlds, they did not stop cultivating at the same time. They were not living beings that were born with intelligence in this world, so they could not come into contact with that unknown place like those living beings and guide the power from that unknown place. However, they had the methods that Luo Fan had imparted to them, and Luo Fan had guided them in their cultivation. This allowed them to not lose their direction because of this, and they were able to continuously advance along the path of cultivation that Luo Fan had planned for them. This allowed them to not lose their direction because of this, and they were able to continuously advance along the path of cultivation that Luo Fan had planned for them. In particular, after witnessing the battle between Luo Fan and those living beings this time, they were even more inspired by the methods of many living beings. They had gained a lot of inspiration from Luo Fan's methods. At this moment, as they entered the path of cultivation, these inspirations would pop up from time to time, making them feel that their path forward seemed to be getting wider and wider. It was getting easier and easier. This made them even more immersed in their cultivation, and they gradually forgot about everything in the outside world. While the two of them were strengthening the world and cultivating at the same time, Luo Fan, who was in the palace, had already started cultivating. This time, his cultivation was no longer the same as before, where he entered that unknown place to comprehend the mysteries of the true sage to perfect his worldview. Instead, he worked hard to cultivate according to the rules of the worldview, to improve his cultivation realm. Although perfecting the rules of the worldview was the foundation for him to become a sage, to him, it was more important than the cultivation realm. However, before he became a true sage, the significance of the cultivation realm to him could not be underestimated. Not only did the rules of the worldview need to be transformed into the cultivation realm to allow him to step into the true sage level and become truly eternal and indestructible, omnipotent and omniscient. He was an omniscient existence. More importantly, if he could not quickly convert his potential into strength, he could encounter a disaster at any time in this dangerous world. Not to mention anything else, just the willpower that easily made him feel that his life was in danger was not something that he could resist at the moment. If he did not transform the improvement of the rules of the worldview into the cultivation realm, how could he have the ability to resist the willpower the next time he encountered it? The rules of the worldview was the absolute foundation. Cultivating according to the rules of the worldview was simply like following a map, and there were no obstacles or bottlenecks along the way. At this moment, in Luo Fan's heart, countless profound mysteries of the true sage had been completely understood by him after a slight analysis based on the description of the worldview. The various combinations and the mysteries of the combinations were also easily analyzed by him in this process. And all these mysteries eventually turned into resources to strengthen the essence of his life, turning into a driving force that pushed his life origin to grow, so that all these things were gradually strengthened as time passed. Looking at it from another angle, all of these enhancements caused his cultivation level to continuously increase. In this kind of strengthening, without any bottlenecks and obstacles, Luo Fan's body gradually emitted an indescribable aura. This aura was so pure, so condensed, and with a slight fluctuation, it made Luo Fan feel like he had merged with heaven and earth, but also transcended heaven and earth. This aura did not spread out endlessly. After it left Luo Fan's body, it just continued to accumulate in this palace. It was as if the walls of this palace had the absolute effect of isolating auras. This aura was so profound that as it continued to accumulate in this palace, it gradually changed the space-time in this palace. This kind of change did not cause many strange worlds to appear in this palace. In fact, the degree of condensation of this aura was so pure that it could not even contain the world that it had transformed into. This kind of change turned everything in this palace into this kind of aura, whether it was time, space, matter, energy, the mysteries of the true sage, or the fragments of the great Tao. That appearance vaguely made this aura seem to have the power that was guided from an inexplicable place. Chapter 1593. Time passed by slowly. Top, Novel X. In the blink of an eye, thousands of years had passed. During these thousands of years, the development speed of the entire civilized country had almost reached the peak in history. In just a short 1,000 years, it had already completed the development that might not have been able to be completed in the past hundreds of thousands of years. After the development of the entire civilized country, its territory had already expanded by more than 3 times. Although it was still insignificant compared to the world that was changed when the 11 false saints became false saints and had yet to reach the limit, its power was no longer something that could be compared to 1,000 years ago. However, in this civilized country, it was not a unified country. Instead, there were countless countries of various sizes. These countries competed with each other, and there was no lack of wars of various sizes. However, due to the suppression of the 11 false saints, the scale of these wars was limited to a small area. This scale of war did not cause a disaster to the entire civilized country. Instead, it formed a kind of pushing force, causing the development of the civilized country to become faster and faster. The light of all kinds of wisdom was constantly surging, causing the situation of the civilized country to continuously change. It could be said that the current appearance of the entire civilized country was completely different from 1,000 years ago. Although the cultivation civilization did not improve much compared to before, the number of powerhouses in it had increased by countless times. There were such changes in this civilized country. Outside this civilized country, in every corner of the world, there were also small civilized countries appearing one after another. Because these civilized countries were separated and independent from each other, the civilizations that they developed were all different. They had all kinds of strange characteristics. However, no matter what kind of civilization they were, their potential was extremely huge. Moreover, although most of the civilizations had bumps in the entire development process and encountered the danger of being wiped out many times, in the end, they all turned out well. They narrowly escaped death. After passing through all the difficulties and going through many failures, they finally allowed these civilized countries to continuously develop and grow stronger. Until now, although they had not completely gained a foothold in their respective places of birth, at the very least, they were no longer so easily destroyed. Their resistance and ability to protect themselves had already reached an extremely high level. Of course, this was the development of most of the civilized countries outside of this civilized country. However, There were also many civilized countries that had been crushed and annihilated by the living beings that were filled with hostility towards them. In the end, only ruins were left all over the world. In fact, in comparison, the civilizations that had been crushed and wiped out were not much worse than the civilizations that had narrowly escaped death. It could be said to be half and half. What emerged from these changes was a chapter of blood and fire, and what was reflected was a tenacious fighting spirit. Compared to this vast, civilized country that was guarded by 11 sages, the civilized countries that grew up independently in the outside world faced greater dangers because of the harsh environment. Therefore, every country that could survive was stronger than the one that was guarded, and their ability to protect themselves was also stronger. From the looks of it, its potential was even stronger than the civilization in the center. 1,000 years was an extremely long period of time for an ordinary nation. It was enough to change dynasties 2 or 3 times. However, in this world, in the face of this boundless land and the environment of countless powerful living beings that could easily crush them, 1,000 years was so short. In such a short period of time, the many independent civilized countries outside of the civilized countries did not have their previous inheritances, although they had developed various cultivation civilizations, allowing them to obtain strong resistance abilities. However, those cultivation civilizations were extremely crude. Until now, no living being had been able to raise their strength to the pseudo-sage level through cultivation. It was naturally extremely difficult to raise one to the pseudo-sage level in other worlds, and it might take billions of years to do so. However, this was not the case in this world. This world was filled with endless true sage mysteries and great Tao fragments. As long as one knew how to use these, it was extremely easy to raise one's cultivation realm. Normally speaking, if an existence like Luo Fan was thrown into this world as an ordinary person, as long as he could survive, 1,000 years would be enough for him to grow to the peak of the level 9 pseudo-sage level. He might even become a pseudo-sage directly if he was not careful. Under such a background, there were billions of living beings in the many civilized countries, but not a single one could reach the pseudo-sage level. This was enough to show how crude the cultivation civilizations that were born in these civilized countries were. However, this was obviously unavoidable. The emergence of a cultivation civilization was definitely a process from scratch, from crude to fine, from weak to prosperous. If there was no inheritance, it would be impossible for a civilization to grow to such a prosperous state as soon as it was born. Even in this world, it would take hundreds of thousands of years for the cultivation civilizations of those civilized countries to grow to the point where they could give birth to pseudo-sages. It was only a short 1,000 years, and it was still far from that. Your Majesty, many strange, weak living beings have suddenly appeared in this area. I can vaguely sense an inexplicable sense of danger from them. I don't know if I should eliminate them. In a strange space-time in this world, such a voice sounded. This space-time was billions of light years away from the area where Luo Fan was. Moreover, this entire space-time was hidden in the void and looked chaotic. The mysteries of true divinity and the fragments of great Tao were piled up in an extremely strange and mysterious state, faintly forming that indescribable state. Of course, however, it was only faintly discernible. Compared to the true, inexplicable existence, it was still an immeasurable distance away. At this moment, the one who spoke in the space-time was a living being that looked like a wild boar with long horns. At this moment, this living being was lying at the edge of this space-time respectfully. And in the center of this space-time, above the position that seemed to be filled with the mysteries of true sages and the endless great Tao fragments slowly rotated, a living being that looked like a human and vaguely had the characteristics of a connate Tao aptitude sat cross-legged. This living being, it seemed to be a young man. It also seemed to be an old man. It seemed to be a man, but it also seemed to be a woman. It even gave people a feeling that they would completely forget the next moment when they turned their heads away. At this moment, it listened to the words of the long-horned wild boar. It slowly opened its eyes. Its eyes contained earth-shattering wisdom. At the moment it opened its eyes, wisps of willpower seeped out from its eyes and directly disturbed this space-time. The operation of the mysteries of true sages that were simulating the inexplicable existence directly formed an inexplicable chaos. This willpower existed for a while before it was retracted. Immediately afterward, endless light and shadows were reflected in its eyes, showing a vast and boundless land. It also showed the large and small civilized countries that had appeared on the vast land, and there were also countless living beings with connate Tao aptitude in the civilized countries that were evolving the various forms of the mortal world. These various lights and shadows lasted for a long time before they were annihilated. Then, the living beings said, "Ignore it." This voice was like thunder, like the sound of the great Tao, and more like a kind of concept attack. As soon as it appeared, the originally chaotic mysteries of true sages and great Tao fragments in this space-time all collapsed. Above the edge of this space-time, the body of the long-horned wild boar-like creature shook violently, and the power in its body surged violently. Wisps of concepts emerged from its body, and it struggled to resist the surrounding sound waves. Its eyes were filled with indescribable pain. After a long time, when the sound waves disappeared, the surrounding mysteries of true sages and great Tao fragments began to recondense as if time had reversed. After evolving again, the various changes that had occurred to its body finally calmed down, and a hint of relief appeared on its face. At this moment, it finally understood what its emperor was talking about. Immediately, it did not dare to delay and bowed in response. It glanced at this space-time with some reluctance, and gradually disappeared in this space-time. It was directly thrown out. After the wild boar-like creature disappeared, the living being in the center murmured, "I still can't control my power." These words caused the entire space-time to instantly collapse, causing the space-time to fall into the deepest layer of chaos. After a long while, the space-time slowly recovered due to the disappearance of the sound waves, and once again revealed the appearance of the scene in the inexplicable place. At this moment, a wisp of foreign intent suddenly appeared in this space-time. Although this wisp of intent was extremely small, its essence was unimaginably high. Once it appeared, it caused the space-time that had just returned to normal to collapse again, and it once again fell into absolute chaos. The living being in the center felt the arrival of this intent, and its eyelids twitched. "Emperor, what are you doing here? Nuclear Emperor, do you really not know why I'm here?" A faint voice came from that wisp of intent. This voice was like the voice of the living being in this space-time, and it once again pushed the chaotic scene into an abyss of chaos, causing the chaos to become even more severe to the point that it could not recover in a short period of time. "Cut the crap," the living being called the Nuclear Emperor said faintly. "You really don't want to care about those living beings? You must know that they're going to become the new main characters of this world. If we wait for them to develop to their limits, we might be overthrown and reduced to dust," the wisp of intent said. "Reduced to dust? I'm not as unconfident as you are," the Nuclear Emperor said faintly. "How is this a matter of confidence? This is the law of this world." The Emperor, who is also the owner of that wisp of intent, continued to speak. As the two of them spoke, all sorts of terrifying powers directly collided and stirred up the entire space-time. It caused the chaos in this space-time to deepen. Vaguely, it had already revealed a chaotic characteristic. This wasn't because this chaos directly formed a state of chaos. Instead, when this chaos reached its limit, it would eventually cause the space-time to collapse, revealing what was beneath the space-time, or rather, what was behind the space-time. The characteristics of the chaotic state had come out. In such an environment, if the longhorn wild boar had appeared here, it might have been completely crushed by this chaos. Of course, it was also possible that he could hold out for a longer period of time. But in the end, it was forced into a chaotic state by this terrifying might. In the end, all traces of its existence were completely erased. A new main character. What does the old protagonist have to do with us? For me, the most important thing right now is, it was cultivation. It was to break through the current bottleneck. Don't tell me you're not like that. The nuclear emperor didn't say anything about being confident or beating him to the ground. Instead, he asked directly, "How heartless?" Emperor Nung let out a long sigh. "You're not heartless. If you're not heartless, then why don't you attack?" The nuclear emperor said nonchalantly, "Huh, that will let out a faint laugh." Then, that wisp of will slowly disappeared. In the end, it disappeared as abruptly as it had appeared. After it disappeared, the various fragments of the true Saint mysteries and great Tao fragments in this space-time began to distort with great difficulty. Bit by bit, they condensed and reconstructed. In the end, it took a long time for them to return to their original state. Then, they slowly revolved around the nuclear emperor in the center like before. He did not know if it was an illusion, but the mysteries of the true saint and the fragments of the great Tao that had been formed seemed to be even purer and more condensed than before. The scene that had been created seemed to be even more similar to the scene that had been created. The nuclear emperor didn't care about any of this. At this moment, a faint sneer appeared on his face as he muttered, "You want to use me as cannon fodder? Do you really think I'm stupid?" Along with this voice, the space-time that had just recovered began to collapse again. It took a long time for it to condense and return to its original state. However, if one calculated the time it took for it to collapse and condense, one would find that the speed of condensing seemed to have increased a little compared to before. After this change, the nuclear emperor began to close his eyes again. In the entire space-time, aside from the true Saint mysteries and the great Tao fragments, there was no other movement. Just as the conversation that would decide the fate of a civilized nation occurred in an unknown space and time, a new change occurred in the central civilized nation. On this day, a powerful aura suddenly soared into the sky from the palace that Guizhou was in. This aura broke through the layers of clouds in the sky and spread out. It directly engulfed the entire civilized country, making all living beings in the civilized country feel the existence of this aura. Compared to Guizhou's previous aura, this aura had an omnipotent, omniscient, and even eternal charm. At the same time, the range of the civilized country, or rather, the space-time protected by the 11 false saints, underwent a subtle change. A change that did not belong to this space-time, a characteristic that did not belong to this space, had unknowingly been added to this space-time. Immediately afterward, Guizhou's figure slowly stepped out of his palace. At this moment, the wisdom in his eyes was more than 100 times stronger than before. As he stood there, it was as if the entire world was standing there. The mysterious aura around him was not something he could compare to in the past. At this moment, he raised his head and looked around. Countless mysterious lights and shadows appeared in his eyes. There seemed to be countless inexplicable mysteries flowing through his eyes. As for the 11 hidden false sages, they were all exposed in his eyes, and he could see through them directly. At this moment, the 11 false saints each sensed something and immediately came out of their respective cultivation places. They bowed to Guizhou and said, "Congratulations to the Creator for becoming a saint." When Guizhou heard this, the powerful aura that had originally spread across hundreds of millions of miles began to quickly retract. In the blink of an eye, he had already returned to his original appearance, and nothing special could be seen anymore. At the same time, the countless mysterious lights and shadows that had appeared in his eyes completely disappeared at this moment, as if they had never appeared in the first place. After that, he said, "I'm just walking the cultivation path that I've skipped in the past. What's there to be happy about?" As he said that, he did not wait for the false saints to speak and directly said, "I'm going to talk about the method of proving the Tao today. Those who are fated can come and listen." As he spoke, he casually patted the void. The space-time within hundreds of millions of miles naturally had waves of power transmitting. In the blink of an eye, an island was directly opened up in that strange existence above this normal space-time. The scenery was beautiful, and there were strange flowers and plants everywhere. There were all kinds of spiritual beasts overflowing with immortal chi everywhere. Everywhere was filled with the mysteries of true saints. The island was the truth of the great Tao. At first glance, this island did not seem too big, but no matter how many living beings entered it, it did not seem crowded at all. Just from this little change, it was already enough to tell. Gui Shou, who had reconfirmed his Tao and become a false saint, had improved a lot compared to before. In the past, although Gui Shou had gone through many cultivation sessions and had already raised his strength to a point where he could even condense a concept and could even be comparable to the living beings in the big organizations, second only to the strongest leader. However, he was definitely unable to control it so meticulously and easily. If it was to him back then, it would not have been difficult for him to create an island. However, if he wanted to place this island here at the right place and use his power to make this island have the various characteristics it had now, it would be a little difficult to do. Although he already knew that he had definitely improved a lot. When he really used his power and felt that feeling of being able to do as he pleased, that feeling of omnipotence, Gui Shou still felt an indescribable emotion. At this moment, he secretly blushed at his previous ignorance of the immensity of heaven and earth. In the past 1,000 years, through Luo Fan's hint, through the process of the 11 false saints becoming false saints, and through his own understanding and sensing of that inexplicable place, he finally walked the path of proving the Tao again and condensed his own foundation again. From then on, he finally broke through the limit and proved a realm that he had surpassed in the past, the false saint realm. After attaining this realm, he instantly felt that his connection with heaven and earth had suddenly been greatly strengthened. Although the various things in the world could originally be seen, they were separated by a layer of mystery. At this moment, they seemed so vivid and concrete in his eyes. It felt as if everything had become a part of his body, allowing him to control them according to his will. After all these emotions, he suddenly felt an indescribable sense of respect and gratitude towards his master, Luo Fan. Moreover, he felt indescribably fortunate that he directly acknowledged Luo Fan as his master after he was defeated by Luo Fan. If he had not admitted defeat so decisively back then, he would probably still be as muddle-headed as before. In fact, he might have already been killed by some unknown, unforeseen event, just like the living beings that had occasionally been crushed and killed by this civilized country in the past 1,000 years as he thought about it. He bowed to the hall where Luo Fan was from afar. Then, he turned around and took a light step, directly crossing the level of space-time and entering the island he had created. Behind him, the 11 false saints also bowed to the hall where Luo Fan was. They were true false saints and had outstanding intelligence. Naturally, they knew who Gui Shou was bowing to and vaguely knew what he meant. How could they dare to be negligent? After bowing, they turned around and followed Gui Shou into the island that was higher than normal space-time, but lower than that inexplicable place. After entering this island, they truly felt the inexplicable shock in their eyes. This was because as soon as they entered this island, they could already feel that the inexplicable place that originally existed above their heads had become extremely clear. Chapter 1594. Fawn, color equals red. Squinting eyes face. Beej, due to the changes here, these false saints fell into an inexplicable state at this moment. For a moment, countless inspirations appeared, and countless sparks of wisdom continuously burst forth in their hearts. Under this inspiration and the sparks of wisdom, they felt that many of the problems they had encountered in the process of cultivation in the past had suddenly been solved. For a moment, they felt as if the world had become clear and the world had become completely different from before. In the past 1,000 years, these false saints had been carefully consolidating their false saint realm, just like what Luo Fan had said back then. However, they had naturally broken through to the false saint realm because of the changes in the world. Compared to the false saints who had cultivated bit by bit, grown bit by bit, and crossed realms bit by bit, their understanding of cultivation and comprehension of the great Tao were somewhat insufficient. This kind of inadequacy was reflected in their cultivation. Even though they had greatly improved over the years, and even though they had grown quite a bit, it was still not enough for them to cultivate. However, such improvement and growth were not enough to completely solve the doubts that had appeared in their hearts at the same time. This way, in the short 1,000 years, if the problems they had accumulated were recorded in words, there would probably be hundreds of billions of words. In such a state, if they were to wait for them to impart the Tao of false saints to the entire civilized country, they would need to learn a lot of literature. FX. It would take tens of thousands of years for them to be able to do so. However, at this moment, Gui Shou had yet to begin to describe the Tao of false saints that he had comprehended over the years. However, they had already been stimulated by this island and were constantly receiving nourishment from that inexplicable place. They constantly felt that the cultivation problems that they had accumulated in the past were constantly being solved. Stop. At this moment, Gui Shou said calmly. Although this voice was ordinary, it directly penetrated all of their hearts and pulled all of them back from that inexplicable state, causing all of their eyes to suddenly reveal an inexplicable reluctance. There was actually an indescribable dissatisfaction in their eyes. One must know that just now, he felt that he had gained something at every moment. He felt that his cultivation realm was improving at every moment. The feeling of feeling that the problems that they had accumulated in the past were being solved was truly wonderful. But at this moment, their creator broke their state and woke them up from that indescribably wonderful feeling. To them, this was the first time their creator had broken this state. It was as if he had been kicked down from the highest peak. That feeling was unbearable. It goes without saying. In fact, it could even be said that if it wasn't their creator, Gui Shou, who did this, they would not be able to survive. If it was anyone else, no matter how strong that person was, they would definitely turn hostile at this moment and use their strongest attack towards the person who did this. How could he only show such dissatisfaction in his eyes? Gui Shou naturally knew what they were feeling, so he said indifferently, "Think about it again. What did you comprehend before?" These words were like a bucket of ice water being poured over their heads, causing the 11 false saints to feel the anger in their hearts suddenly extinguish and their minds clear up. They carefully recalled according to Gui Shou's guidance, and finally found that the answers to the cultivation problems they had encountered in that inexplicable place had completely disappeared at this time. It felt as if they had never found the answer. The problem was still the same, waiting for them to explore the answer. What's going on? At this moment, the 11 false saints could not help but exclaim. At this moment, how could they still be dissatisfied with Gui Shou? How could they still be reluctant to part with that feeling? There were even a few false saints who were filled with an indescribable sense of panic, feeling as if some huge conspiracy was being carried out. Gui Shou said indifferently, "It's impossible to bring out all the mysteries you have comprehended in that inexplicable place. Once you leave, all the principles you have comprehended in there will naturally disappear. Even I can't keep them. Therefore, it's just a waste of time for you to directly comprehend the principles in there." Hearing this, the false saints were shocked. The inexplicable place that they could originally sense but could not enter actually had such unbelievable mysteries. This was something they had never heard of or seen before. At this moment, when they heard Gui Shou mention it, they felt as if their horizons had been broadened. After the shock, the false saints all bowed to Gui Shou and repeatedly apologized, saying that they shouldn't have misunderstood Gui Shou's thoughts just now. Naturally, Gui Shou would not be stingy to such an extent. He only smiled faintly and slowly closed his eyes. Gui Shou was currently at the highest point of the island, on a platform. Below, the 11 false saints were on 11 praying mats. Behind the meditation cushions of the 11 false sages was a vast space. Here, it looked very ordinary, but every rise and fall of the ground and every line on it contained profound mysteries and unimaginable principles. It could be said that even if a living being came here and could not understand the principles that Gui Shou was talking about, just observing and memorizing these lines would be enough to obtain great benefits and allow their cultivation realm and great Tao to increase unbelievably. When this island was opened in Gue's show and the 11 false saints entered the island to wait, the entire civilized country below was already in an uproar. Gue's show's words that those who were fated could go and listen to the lecture spread throughout the entire civilized country. Although most of the living beings in this civilized country were born from the world, their templates were all connate Tao Constitution living beings created by Gue's show. Even though they were born from the world, it did not change the connection between them and Gue's show. When Gue's show's words spread, all the living beings instantly understood who the person who spoke was. They instantly understood who the person who spoke was and knew how powerful the person who spoke was compared to them. For a moment, almost every living being who heard this voice had a strong desire to go and listen to the lecture. It's finally here. I want to go and listen to the lecture. In a certain deep mountain in the civilized country, a living being that looked like an old man said to his companion, a living being that looked like an old woman, "Listen to what? Don't you want your son anymore?" The old woman said angrily, "Children and grandchildren have their own blessings. Since he has gone out to adventure, it's already his own business. It's also his fate to encounter any danger," the old man said calmly. "What did you say?" The old woman looked at her old friend of hundreds of years in disbelief. She suddenly realized that she did not seem to know this person in front of her. The old man flicked his sleeves. He stood up and walked out of the cave abode in a seemingly slow but actually fast manner. Although the entire civilized country was insignificant compared to the entire world, to the point that it could even be ignored. However, it was still a distance of billions of miles. Within this range, there were all kinds of terrains. Mountains and plains, mountains and hills, grasslands and deserts, rivers, lakes, and even oceans of various sizes existed here. Some of the living beings in the civilized country gathered together. They formed countries and lived like mortals relying on the country to survive. Those who pursued cultivation, power, and immortality were like ordinary cultivators, setting up their own immortals' caves in the depths of the mountains and forests, cultivating day and night. Among them, there were even sects and legacies that occupied famous mountains and beautiful sceneries. Compared to other civilized countries, this one had a long history. Nowadays, the cultivation civilization here was many times more prosperous than in other places. As for the cultivation legacies and cultivation techniques, there were hundreds of schools of thought contending for supremacy. There were simply too many to count. The old man and the old woman were only independent cultivators, and the mountain they resided in was only an extremely ordinary mountain in this civilized country. Although it was quite wondrous, it was far inferior to the scenery of a true, famous mountain. "Are you really so heartless?" the old woman shouted when she saw the old man walk out without any hesitation. "It's not that I'm heartless. It's just that we humans have the responsibility to strengthen our race. Compared to the rise and fall of the race, the personal feelings of a small family are insignificant," the old man said as he walked. Good, good. Since you don't care, I will. This time, I will go and save the son of the Chi-Man," the old woman said angrily. "What's the point of you going? You should come with me to listen to the lecture." The old man turned around with an indescribable worry in his eyes. "Scram!" the old woman roared angrily. She turned around and walked past the old man, heading in a certain direction. "Why can't you understand?" The old man looked at the old woman's departing figure and sighed. He lifted his foot and walked in another direction. Whether it was fate or not depended on whether they knew where to go to listen to the lecture. The old man happened to be the fated one. He had a vague feeling about where to listen to the lecture. At this moment, he was heading in the direction he sensed. Similar things like the argument between the old man and the old woman were happening all over the world. Countless creatures resolutely abandoned everything and directly listened to the lecture based on the feeling in their hearts. There were also countless creatures who didn't want to leave what they were doing, so they threw the feeling in their hearts to the side and just went about their own business. These various changes caused countless tragedies and comedies to constantly evolve within a radius of hundreds of millions of miles in the entire civilized country. The creatures who followed the guidance of their hearts to listen to the lecture walked out of the normal space-time and entered the island created by Gui's show. They arrived on the platform where Gui's show and the false sages were. Of course, although they came here, their perspective was completely different from Gui's show and the false sages. In their eyes, this was an empty plaza, and there was only an empty platform in front of the plaza. Apart from that, Gui's show, false sages, and praying mats did not exist at all. These creatures, some were strong, some were weak. The strong ones had even reached the level of a level 9 false sage. As for the weak ones, they had only cultivated dermic powers and barely achieved the immortal Tao. After these creatures came to this square, they naturally felt an indescribable shock. All the lights and shadows on this square, all the lines, and all the ups and downs brought indescribable emotions to their hearts. It made them naturally let go of all the competitive thoughts and directly pick a corner to sit down. They began to carefully comprehend the many bullies, the changes of many lines. As time passed, the number of creatures that came from all over increased. 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million. A few days later, the number of creatures that came to listen to the lecture had already exceeded 100 billion. And these 100 billion creatures were distributed in this square that didn't seem very wide. However, the square didn't seem crowded at all, nor was there any worry of being unable to accommodate them. The entire square was so mysterious. Looking closely at every creature, there was quite a bit of space around them that allowed them to move freely. However, on the whole, this square, which could only accommodate hundreds of creatures at most, had now been stuffed with 100 billion creatures. This mysterious change made the creatures in the square look forward to what they could obtain from this lecture. Just this square alone was already so mysterious and unbelievable. How mysterious would the true principles of the lecture be? Among these 100 billion creatures, almost all of them had extremely firm Tao hearts. Not every living being could be as resolute as the old man in abandoning his wife. However, these living beings were all extremely determined in their goals. They wanted to reach the end of their cultivation path even more urgently than other living beings, wanted to reach a higher realm of cultivation. After waiting for 9 days, when no more creatures came from the civilized country, Gui Shou casually waved his hand and directly cut off the connection between this island and normal space-time. This made this island truly become a completely independent island, causing all living beings to instantly lose their senses of this island. After that, Gui Shou directly changed the perspective of all living beings, causing Gui Shou and the 11 false sages to appear in the eyes of the hundreds of billions of living beings. Greetings, Creator. Greetings, Sage. In an instant, the hundreds of billions of living beings hurriedly stood up and bowed. The scene of hundreds of people bowing was already extremely shocking. It went without saying how shocking it was for hundreds of billions of people to bow at the same time. At this moment, the sound wave even broke through the island, broke through this strange existence, and directly crashed into the civilized country. It was like a thunderclap that reverberated above the entire civilized country. For a moment, countless living beings looked at the void in shock. Among them, the living beings who could originally sense the guidance but had given up on this guidance felt a little regretful. Are you regretting it? In a certain city, a woman was very unhappy and said to the disappointed man beside her. When a man heard this, he came back to his senses and said, "How can that be? I don't know how long it will take to listen to the lecture this time. I can't stand not being with you during this period of time. I think you're regretting it." The woman said relentlessly, No, yes. You must be blaming me. Blame me for not letting you go, because I can't go to listen to the lecture. Isn't that right?" The woman shouted. There was a flash of bitterness in the man's eyes, but he still tried to coax the woman. It was only after a long while that the woman finally broke into a smile. However, the man vaguely felt that he had probably lost a huge opportunity. "I hope I won't regret my choice today in the future," he thought to himself. He suddenly noticed the woman beside him who seemed unruly but had a faint uneasiness in the depths of her eyes. All kinds of thoughts were instantly abandoned and replaced with a heart full of tenderness. No matter what, this is my decision. For her. So what if I give up this opportunity? He instantly made up his mind. The two of them were a pair of cultivation companions, and their respective cultivation bases were already extremely profound. When they heard the voice transmission of the lecture, they planned to go and listen to the lecture at the same time. However, after they set off, he discovered that only the man could sense where the lecture was, but the woman couldn't sense it at all. Moreover, even if they set off at the same time, the man and the woman would eventually get separated without them knowing. The man continued to head toward the lecture, while the woman could only stay in normal space-time. After experimenting dozens of times, they were finally convinced that this woman was the fated person, and this man was the fated person after that. Naturally, he was conflicted. One had to know that the dangers of this world were beyond imagination. Although there were 11 false saints suppressing this civilized country, and it was much safer than the outside world. However, after all, it was impossible to change the nature of the world. Who knew when the environment of the world would change slightly? It was already enough to cause the living beings in this civilized country to suffer a calamity. Such things were really not rare in the past 1,000 years. And, obviously, going to listen to the creator's lecture was a process that took an unknown amount of time. Perhaps by the time he returned, thousands or even tens of thousands of years would have passed. In that case, if the man left the woman here and went to listen to the lecture, he might be separated by life and death by the time he returned. In other words, if he made the decision to go and listen to the lecture, he had to be prepared to be separated by life and death. How could a pair of extremely loving Tao companions not be conflicted? In the end, their final decision was obviously like this. The man gave up on the opportunity to listen to the lecture and stayed here to accompany the woman. In fact, this kind of thing was not uncommon in this civilized country. Some were Tao companions, and one of them could sense it. Some were father and son, some were mother and daughter, and some were even good friends. Because of these inexplicable ties, many living beings gave up on the opportunity to listen to the lecture and stayed in this civilized country to accompany their friends and family. This was also the reason why most living beings in this civilized country gave up on the opportunity to listen to the lecture. At this moment, under the majestic voice that even penetrated the barrier between normal space-time and that strange existence, countless living beings suddenly felt regretful. They vaguely felt that they had lost an important opportunity. Guei Shou, who was on this island, naturally did not care about the thoughts of the living beings. He was not joking when he said that they could listen to the lecture if they were fated. The way he guided the living beings to listen to the lecture was not according to any rules. Instead, he guided them randomly according to their cultivation. As for what kind of living beings would receive the opportunity and what kind of living beings would come to listen to the lecture, it was all up to the heavens. In other words, whether or not the living beings who came to listen to the lecture would be decided by the heavens. However, he was not the one who ordered it. Under such circumstances, how could he care about what kind of living being would come here and what kind of living being would give up on the opportunity? After everyone bowed, he did not waste any time and directly explained the various cultivation techniques that he had comprehended in the past 1,000 years, including the method to verify his Tao and become a false sage. He went from simple to deep, explaining everything in detail. As he was preaching such a supreme principle, every word that he uttered turned into Tao sounds that caused the endless mysteries on the island to vibrate continuously. This caused the endless mysteries of the true sage on the island to vibrate continuously and evolve continuously. As this happened, the light around the square gradually changed. It evolved into the void of the universe, the various states of the human world, and countless worlds. It also displayed the truth that Guei Shou was talking about in the beginning, because the truth that Guei Shou was talking about was not profound. Almost all living beings could understand it. However, as time passed and the truth he was talking about became more and more profound, the number of living beings that could understand it decreased. As a result, more and more living beings gradually fell into a daze as they listened to the lecture and gradually lost all perception of the outside world. Of course, whether they could understand or not, they would be able to obtain great benefits by coming here to listen. Chapter 1595. Fawn, color equals red, squinting eyes face. This lecture lasted for 3,000 years. From the most basic method of guiding qi into the body to proving the Tao and becoming a false saint, he even talked about how to cultivate and improve in this world after becoming a false saint. Such a lecture was a great opportunity for every one of the billions of living beings listening to the lecture. During this process, every single living being obtained great benefits. Ordinary cultivators, needless to say, had their horizons broadened, allowing them to peak at a path from zero all the way to the peak of cultivation, to eternal immortality, and to a path that could not be worn down by 1,000 tribulations. Even for the 11 false saints, they had gained a lot of benefits during this process. Although these false saints had already cultivated for a long time before the living beings in this civilized country had completely become the protagonists of this world. However, their cultivation was sorted out by themselves after all. They had comprehended it bit by bit from zero. If there were any detours, improper bends, omissions, or mistakes, it was not something worth being surprised at all. Therefore, it could be said that although these false saints had improved step by step since they started cultivating, their understanding of cultivation was still extremely shallow. Not only did they not know the Tao of false saints, but they also did not know how to cultivate to become a false saint, and how to improve after becoming a false saint. Even the entire cultivation process before that was still unclear. And now, in these 3,000 years, the entire Tao lecture process of Gue Shou had made up for this entire process for them. After all, although Gue Shou was not a living being who had cultivated step by step from zero to where he was now, the height he was standing at was already much higher than that of a false saint. Moreover, he had also gone through the process of proving the Tao and becoming a false saint before this. His understanding of the entire cultivation process was naturally not something that those false saints could compare to. Even compared to an existence like Luo Fan, who had exhausted the essence of cultivation, there was still a huge gap. However, he crushed all the living beings listening to the lecture. There was absolutely no problem. Moreover, because these living beings were created by him, everything about them came from him. His own understanding of cultivation, regardless of whether there were any mistakes or omissions, it was the most suitable for these creatures. It could be said that he was second only to Luo Fan, who had exhausted the essence of cultivation. 3,000 years passed in the blink of an eye for the billions of living beings who were listening. Even after Gue Shou finished his lecture, they were still unsatisfied and wanted Gue Shou to continue. However, this period of time had changed the entire civilized country below. But it was practically earth-shattering. For those who didn't listen to the Tao, this was already a long enough period of time, enough for their entire living conditions to change drastically. Right now, if these creatures were to return to the civilized country, they would definitely find that everything that they were familiar with in the past had disappeared. For example, the old woman who had fallen out with the old man had long since disappeared. For example, the others who had abandoned their Tao companions would probably discover it when they returned to a civilized country. Their Tao companions had already become Tao companions with others. These various changes would obviously have an incomparably huge impact on the hearts of many living beings, but it was enough to make many living beings have a new understanding of the Tao lecture this time. Perhaps some living beings would regret because of this, or perhaps some living beings would rejoice and be happy because of this. However, Gue Shou didn't care about these at all. At this moment, Gue Shou was extremely satisfied with the achievements of this Tao lecture. This was because during the process of lecturing, he had already discovered that there were more than 100,000 living beings who had the potential to become false saints. The probability of finding more than 100,000 living beings out of 100 billion living beings was really extremely low. However, compared to the many living beings who were groping around in a daze, this probability had already increased by more than 1,000 times. Normally speaking, without Gu Shou's lecture, being able to find 10 living beings out of 100 billion living beings who could become false saints was already considered to have received too much favor from the heavens and earth. They were the main characters among the main characters of the world. How could they find more than 100,000 living beings? After the lecture ended, Gu Shou casually said, "This lecture has ended. Apart from the people I've selected, everyone else can leave." Hearing this, the many living beings woke up from their state of enlightenment. They bowed to Gu Shou and shouted, "Thank you, Creator, for teaching us the Tao." After that, without waiting for them to do anything, Gu Shou waved his hand, and they all disappeared from the island. All of them returned to where they were before they entered the island, and they also scattered across the entire civilized nation. Although this civilized country had nearly doubled in size in the past 3,000 years, they could no longer spread across the entire civilized country when they scattered. Instead, they only spread out in half of the central region of the civilized country. After the many living beings disappeared, only the living beings with the potential to become sages that Gu Shou had chosen were left on the platform of the island. All of you have the potential to become sages. What the Gu Shou said made the over 100,000 living beings who were still bewildered reveal expressions of disbelief. To them, who already understood what a false saint was and how terrifying its power was, becoming a false saint was a great achievement. Every one of them knew very well how great it was. Every single one of them had countless expectations about whether they could become a false saint. However, that was just a vision, just a premonition. None of them were certain that they could become a false saint after knowing how difficult it was to become a false saint. Under such circumstances, suddenly hearing the Creator in front of them directly tell them that they had the possibility of becoming a false saint, it was obvious what kind of surprise it was. However, although it was a surprise, they were all cultivators with profound cultivation after all. They did not make any noise because of this. At this moment, every single one of them maintained their composure, and not a single one of them made any noise. Seeing this, Gu Shou was not surprised. He said, "Previously, when I talked about the Tao of false saints, it was just a rough introduction. If you want to rely on it to become a false saint, you still don't have enough strength. Next, I will tell you the true key to becoming a false saint." As he said that, without waiting for the many living beings to react, he directly started to talk about his own comprehension. This time around, the words that came out of his mouth no longer had any substance. There was no concrete language. It was just a series of Tao sounds that shook the void and the world. The Tao sounds that shook the mysteries of true saints, the fragments of great Tao, and even the life essence of every living being here. Under this Tao sound, every living being felt that they had directly fallen into an indescribable state. In a daze, they seemed to feel that they seemed to have obtained an indescribably huge harvest. However, after thinking about it, it seemed like they had obtained nothing. In this process, they had unknowingly completely lost all perception of the outside world. When they came back to their senses from this dazed state, Yi Zichen's eyes lit up. It was already 10,000 years later. When they came back to their senses, there were waves of enlightenment in their eyes. There seemed to be countless rays of wisdom shining faintly. They seemed to have understood something, but they also didn't seem to understand anything. Only the changes in the perception of heaven and earth, the mysteries of true saints, and even the perception of the great Tao fragments reminded them that they were already completely different from 10,000 years ago. Gu Shou looked down at the hundreds of thousands of living beings, but he felt a little tired. In the past 10,000 years, although he said that he was specifically talking about the key to becoming a false saint, in fact, he had directly used his own cultivation realm and life essence to resonate with all living beings, the world, the mysteries of true saints, and the great Tao fragments. Through this resonance, he imparted his understanding of cultivation and his understanding of the false saint to the many living beings, allowing each of them to engrave the various states of the false saint into the depths of their life instincts. Thus, they would be able to clear the obstacles to becoming a false saint, allowing as many living beings as possible to truly break through the barrier between the false saint and become a false saint. This method was actually developed from a technique that Luo Fan had imparted to him back then. Or rather, it was developed from the technique that Luo Fan had originally prepared for Qing Yi and Yu Ji when he asked Luo Fan to come over. Judging from the performance of these living beings at this moment, his method of preaching the Tao was obviously very effective. At this moment, among the many living beings, the auras of the dozens of living beings near the front suddenly began to churn. Are they going to break through? When Gue Shou saw this, he could not help but smile inexplicably. Although Gue Shou did not set any rules, because of the unwritten rule, the stronger the living being, the closer they were to the front. In other words, the closer they were to the platform Gue Shou was on. The living beings whose auras were changing in front of him were all level 9 pseudo-saints. And if they broke through from level 9 pseudo-saints, they would obviously be false saints. After discovering this, Gue Shou casually waved his hand, and the island sank slightly. It directly broke through the strange existence and descended into normal space-time. It appeared directly above the civilized country, close to the most central mountain peak. The moment they arrived, the changes in the bodies of the dozen or so living beings seemed to suddenly explode, and they began to increase crazily. Powerful and unparalleled auras began to be emitted from their bodies continuously. This aura spread endlessly and began to quickly cover the void within a radius of billions of miles of the entire civilized country. It directly made every living being feel this vast and supreme aura that did not cause them any harm. Under this aura, all the living beings involuntarily knelt in the direction of the island. Following this change, above the void, there was naturally a multicolored light circulating. This multicolored light spread throughout the void within the entire civilized country. It made the entire sky of the civilized country seem to have turned into beautiful jade. It looked so mysterious and beautiful. In this multicolored light, there was a faint sound of joyful thunder. Amidst this sound, wisps of strange fragrance appeared out of thin air and lingered in the entire civilized country. Amidst this strange fragrance, there were also all kinds of inexplicable notes falling, this kind of note. It was somewhat similar to the Tao voice that came out of Gue Shou's mouth and shook all the living beings who heard it. However, it was deeper and more profound. The impact it had caused was even greater. Almost all the living beings felt their souls being cleansed at this moment. They all felt that their souls were being cleansed, and they all discovered that all kinds of inexplicable information flashed through their minds. During this process, the auras of the dozen or so living beings that had caused all kinds of changes began to rapidly increase. There seemed to be endless information in the void, and as it continuously surged into their bodies, it pushed their cultivation realm and began to continuously increase. The bodies of these creatures began to rise higher and higher as they gradually left the island. Moreover, their bodies began to gradually turn into nothingness during this process, as if they had gradually integrated into the world. Time. At this moment, it seemed to have lost all meaning. Everyone forgot the passage of time at this moment. After an unknown period of time, all the changes calmed down. The dozen or so living beings that had completely disappeared into the void trembled and reappeared in the void. However, compared to when they had disappeared, these dozen or so living beings already had a kind of eternal indestructibility on them. They were indestructible and omniscient. They were omniscient and omnipotent. The deep wisdom flickering in their eyes was not much inferior to that of the 11 false saints from before. Obviously, at this moment, these dozen or so cultivators had already successfully broken through the false saint stage, becoming true false saints. The achievements of these dozen or so cultivators instantly made the living beings who were listening to the Tao reveal an inexplicable, complicated expression. Among these complicated expressions, there was envy for those dozen or so living beings, as well as inexplicable anticipation for themselves to eventually become false saints. They were all able to become false saints just by listening to the Tao, and they were not much inferior to them. There were also people who were praised by the Creator to be able to become false saints, so they should not be much inferior to them. The dozen or so false saints naturally did not care about these living beings. After becoming false saints, they did not comprehend the difference between false saints and level 9 false saints. They directly looked at each other and took light steps forward. They arrived on the platform and came before Guei Shou. They bowed to Guei Shou and thanked him for imparting the technique to them. However, Guei Shou smiled faintly and said, "In this world apart from here, there are still countless others of your kind. You guys have become false saints first, but you have to bear the responsibility of protecting them. If you have the heart, you can go and protect them if you have the chance in the future." Hearing this, not only the dozen or so false saints, but even the 11 false saints who had become false saints before also agreed. Guei Shou nodded and waved his hand. In an instant, all the living beings on this island disappeared completely, and they were sent back to the position before they entered the island. Even the 20-odd false saints had been swept out of the island by him at this moment. After that, he lifted his foot and lightly stomped on the ground. The island instantly crumbled into countless fragments, which looked like countless tiny light spots that scattered in all directions. After a while, they disappeared without a trace, as if they were never there in the first place. As for him, he took a step forward and directly arrived in front of the hall where Luo Fan was and stepped into it. "Master, I've already finished preaching the method to become a false saint. I've opened up the path for all living beings in this country to become false saints." After arriving here, Guei Shou was no longer as unfathomable as he was in front of other living beings. Instead, he seemed extremely humble as he bowed to Luo Fan above. After a while, Luo Fan's body, which was cultivating with his eyes closed, gradually broke away from the illusory state. He slowly opened his eyes. Over the years, Luo Fan had been cultivating wholeheartedly and did not care about what was happening in the outside world. At this moment, compared to before, his cultivation realm had already improved greatly. Although it was not completely compatible with the perfection of his world of laws, the gap between them was not too far. It could be said that with his current cultivation realm, he could easily crush himself from more than 10,000 years ago. After opening his eyes, his heart skipped a beat. In the past 10,000 years, he had already clearly understood everything that had happened in the entire civilized country. Naturally, he knew exactly what Guei Shou had been doing for the past 10,000 years. At this moment, he nodded and said, "Well done." However, the country outside has already fallen into an abyss of suffering. Have you not noticed? Guei Shou's heart trembled. His heart shuddered, and he instantly felt an indescribable pressure coming from the void, acting on his life source. This pressure was not from Luo Fan, but an inexplicable feeling, or rather, an inexplicable premonition. This premonition, this feeling, was not something else. It was precisely because he suddenly sensed that something that was closely related to him was happening in an extremely distant place. He felt such a pressure. Guei Shou's expression changed, and he said, "I only felt it now." Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "This is the change of the world. Now, it has been more than 10,000 years since the world has determined the protagonist, but you have not done anything too active. This is the blessing of the world. It is already gradually dispersing. That is why your senses are not as clear as before. What should I do? Master, please teach me." Guei Shou heard this. His expression changed greatly. It should be known that his fate was now completely linked to the creatures with born Taoism aptitude in this civilized country. Under such circumstances, if the world's blessing for them shifted, it obviously meant that the world's blessing for him had also shifted. It was easy to imagine how great a loss it would be for him. How could he not care after understanding this? Go, leave this place. Search for those countries in the world and help them. With your current strength, you can deal with those creatures that will attack you, but those that you can't will not attack you. You already have enough power to protect yourself, Luo Fan said faintly. This was what he had comprehended after his cultivation level had increased. The identity of the world's protagonist was very important to the ordinary creatures in this world. It was enough to affect their safety and their living conditions. Therefore, those creatures must be extremely hostile to the creatures that replace them as the world's protagonist. They must be thinking of ways to get rid of these creatures at all times. However, for those who were truly powerful, such as those who could suppress Luo Fan with a trace of their will and easily rescue the creatures from the big organizations, the identity of the world's protagonist was nothing to them. To them, whether they were the world's protagonist or not, or even whether they existed in this world, was already secondary. Their bodies were already strong enough to resist the heavens and earth. Under such circumstances, they naturally did not care about the new world's protagonist. In other words, as long as they did not provoke them, they could not be bothered. It was because he understood this that Luo Fan would say such words at this time. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Guisho's eyes lit up, and he hurriedly said, "Yes." Luo Fan nodded his head. With a thought, he casually made a grabbing motion with his hand. The living beings that he had enlightened on this mountain peak were all caught by him in a daze and brought into the palace. There were thousands of these creatures, and every one of them was different in size. There were countless of them that were tens of thousands of feet tall and hundreds of thousands of feet tall. However, with so many creatures crammed into this not-so-big hall, it did not seem crowded at all. However, this palace hall easily accommodated all of them. Chapter 1596. Fawn color equals red. Squinting eyes face. Beat Luo Fan looked at the strange creatures and said plainly, "Now that the world has changed, there's no benefit for you to stay here. Now, follow Guisho and earn merits for the new protagonist of this world." These creatures heard every single word he said clearly and understood the meaning behind it. However, when all the words were put together, the creatures couldn't understand what he meant at all. For a time, all of the living beings revealed expressions of confusion and bewilderment. However, Luo Fan's omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient attitude had given them great confidence, making them understand that listening to Luo Fan was the right choice. Therefore, all the creatures knelt and thanked Luo Fan for arranging a way out for them. Then, they turned around to greet Guisho. Guisho looked at them and was overjoyed in his heart. It turned out that if he was alone, there were so many countries in this world that he had to visit. Obviously, he was too busy. Now that he had the help of these living beings, he could naturally relax a lot. Then, he solemnly told the creatures to dispense with the formalities and turn around to thank Luo Fan. Luo Fan nodded slightly and waved his hand to let them leave the hall to do what they needed to do. The arrangement he made with those living beings was not simply to provide some helpers for the longevity turtle. In fact, what he told those living beings was not a lie. Now, the protagonist of this world had changed. Although it didn't seem like there was any earth-shattering change in this world, the situation of this world had changed. However, the situation of the world had changed. It was no longer the same as before. This was something that was certain. In the past, these living beings were the main characters of the world. In this world, they were the main characters. In this world, they still enjoyed the blessings of the heavens. Therefore, no matter what they did, they would only develop better and better. But now, the situation was different. Because of the change of this world, the blessings of the heavens that they enjoyed had disappeared. If they still lived like before, the outcome would only get worse and worse. If they continued to live like before, then the outcome would only get worse and worse. In the end, it was even possible that he would directly die a violent death and disappear without a trace in a certain upheaval. If they wanted to change this outcome, there was only one way, and that was to change their current methods. Changing his current practice of quietly cultivating on this mountain peak was the best choice. Naturally, it was to attach itself to the new protagonist of this world, and then use indirect methods to enjoy the blessings of this world. It was obvious that it wanted to attach itself to the new main character of this world. The best way was, of course, for the new protagonist to create merit and help the new protagonist gain a foothold in this changed world, helping them develop in this world. It was because of this consideration that he directly let these creatures follow Gue Shou out of this civilized country and let them help Gue Shou. Luo Fan had already spoken. Gue Shou and the others naturally couldn't stay here any longer. After they saluted, they turned around and left the hall. After they left the hall, Gue Shou did not hesitate. He directly led these creatures to soar into the sky and rushed toward the nearest civilized country that he could faintly sense. That civilized country was hundreds of millions of miles away from the civilized country. In the process of rushing toward that location, they quickly left the range of this civilized country. The moment they crossed that boundary, they felt an inexplicable feeling. Gue Shou felt that the surroundings had become thousands of times more dangerous. An inexplicable malice was born from nothingness, directly oppressing him, as if it was ready to erase him at any time. The other creatures felt even more obvious. Even their bodies directly began to tremble, as if they felt that their lives would be completely lost in the next moment. Enemies. At this moment, this thought flashed in Gue Shou's mind. At this moment, a figure with 9 heads and 13 arms appeared in front of Gue Shou and the others. Gue Shou was very familiar with this figure. It was one of the many creatures that had fought against Luo Fan. Yes, they have been guarding here, waiting for us to leave. In an instant, this thought appeared in Gue Shou's mind. They finally came out. They made me wait for so many years. The 9-headed, 13-armed creature said. As it spoke, it suddenly attracted an inexplicable and powerful power from an inexplicable place. After this power descended into the normal space-time, it began to change rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into an absolutely pure sealing concept, completely sealing the space-time within an unknown radius of tens of thousands of miles. At this moment, Gue Shou felt as if his body had been completely locked by this sealing concept, as if he could not move at all. As for the other creatures, even their own thoughts and intelligence had been completely sealed by this sealing concept. Everything was maintained at the instant when a 9-headed, 13-armed creature had just used this method. Sensing these changes, Gue Shou suddenly showed a smile. In the past, I was just an ant in your eyes. But now, as he spoke, an indescribable concept suddenly burst out from his body. This concept was also formed by that inexplicable power. Moreover, compared to the surrounding sealing concept, this concept was even more valiant and resolute. In an instant, it had completely turned the surrounding sealing concept into a concept of nothingness. Next, endless power descended from the void and directly integrated into the concept of nothingness that was released from his body. This directly strengthened the concept of nothingness by countless times and directly constructed a concept of nothingness cage. In turn, it trapped the 9-headed, 13-armed creature in front of him. How is this possible? At this moment, the 9-headed, 13-armed creature could not help but exclaim. Seeing the method that Gue Shou had used, he could not help but think of Luo Fan back then. The concept of nothingness that Gue Shou had used now was too similar to the concept of nothingness that Luo Fan had used back then. Not only were the concepts similar, moreover, the intensity and scale were also extremely similar. This made him suddenly have an inexplicable illusion that he was not facing a creature like Gue Shou, who he had completely looked down upon and regarded as an ant. Instead, he was facing hundreds of creatures alone. Luo Fan, who was so powerful that he made people feel hopeless. At this moment, the intense humiliation that he had felt when he was suppressed back then emerged in his heart. This humiliation, soon, it turned into boundless anger. The raging flames gushed out of its body, allowing it to transform the concept of seal around its body into the concept of absolute destruction. This concept of destruction collided with the concept of nothingness cage that Guei Shou had used, causing an earth-shattering reaction. That was space-time. The mysteries of the true sage, the fragments of the great Tao, and all other forces collapsed inch by inch in this earth-shattering reaction. A sound that seemed to be the complete collapse of the whole world was produced from the point of collision and began to flow in all directions. It directly shook the civilized country not far away. At the same time, figures that were originally hidden in all directions appeared because of this vibration. These creatures, they were all the creatures that had been defeated by Luo Fan. Of course, they were only a part of them. Not all the creatures that had been defeated and suppressed by Luo Fan were guarding here. Most of them did not guard here. Instead, they left this place and returned to their respective places of cultivation. At this moment, those creatures that had appeared were all looking at this place with fiery eyes. Some of them were even rubbing their palms. It seemed that they could not wait to pounce on Guei Shou and tear him into pieces. The result of the collision was not that one of them was suppressing the other. Instead, they were equally matched. Guei Shou's concept of nothingness did not completely shatter because of this collision. It was completely destroyed. The concept of destruction that the 9-headed, 13-armed creature had sent out did not completely disappear because of this. During this collision, these two concepts just turned into countless fragments that splashed in all directions. However, facing such a result, both of them had different reactions. Guei Shou showed a satisfied smile, while the 9-headed, 13-armed creature only had shock and disbelief on its face. The reason for this was very simple. Don't forget that tens of thousands of years ago, when Luo Fan fought against this 9-headed, 13-armed creature, although Guei Shou was also a native creature born with innate wisdom, his strength was many times worse than this 9-headed, 13-armed creature. It could be said that if the 9-headed, 13-armed creature wanted to deal with Guei Shou, it did not even need to do it personally. It only needed to casually release a bit of its power, and it would be enough to make Guei Shou die without a burial place. However, at this moment, Guei Shou relied on his own strength and the inexplicable power that he grasped to fight the 9-headed, 13-armed creature in front of him to a standstill. The 9-headed, 13-armed creature could not even hurt those living beings that he wanted to protect. How could Guei Shou not be satisfied with such a huge improvement in just over 10,000 years? The 9-headed, 13-armed creature was in disbelief for the same reason as Guei Shou. It was also because it could easily destroy Guei Shou in the past, but now it could no longer do so. You've made such a huge improvement. At this moment, a voice was heard. Then, a huge figure broke through the void and directly appeared here. This figure had the appearance of a long snake. Moreover, it was a long snake with 2 heads and fish scales on its body. Its body was hundreds of thousands of meters long, and its appearance almost covered half of the sky. At this moment, it was one of its heads that spoke. As it spoke, it had already guided the power from that inexplicable place and began to transform in the void. In the end, it turned into a soft concept that pressed down on Guei Shou. "I don't need you." The 9-headed, 13-armed creature suddenly roared at this moment. Following this roar, it actually did not care about anything else. It actually didn't care and directly condensed the concept of destruction that had just been scattered and directly blasted it towards the concept of softness. The moment the two collided, the collision produced a movement that was no less than the previous collision between Guei Shou's concept of nothingness and the destroyed concept, directly causing the void to shake violently. The 2-headed snake was enraged and said, "What are you doing?" At this moment, it had already stopped spreading the concept of softness and placed it around its body. It was constantly wriggling and changing. Although this soft concept didn't seem to have any power, just from its name, it could completely change the nature of everything. It could change it into a soft concept. Whether it was the true divine occult or the great path fragment, whether it was a living creature or something else, if such a concept really broke through the defense and was used on Guei-Shou, then Guei-Shou's body would definitely collapse completely at the first moment. Everything that existed on his body would directly turn into a soft concept, causing him to almost die and his soul to scatter. "He's mine," the nine-headed, 13-armed creature roared again. However, compared to the two-headed snake, which only wrapped its soft concept around its body to prepare to fight against its enemy, it displayed a stronger offensive ability. The destroyed concept was far away at this moment, as if it was ready to pounce at any moment and fight to the death with the two-headed snake. You can't deal with him at all. Seeing its various performances, the two-headed snake was even more furious. It roared, "I haven't used my strength yet," the nine-headed, 13-armed creature said coldly. "You guys chat, I'll leave first." Guei-Shou saw this opportunity and said with a smile. As he spoke, the concept of nothingness around him trembled slightly. He instantly broke through the concept of destruction that had weakened because he had to guard against the twin-headed snake's concept of softness. Then, he quickly ran away from the civilized country. Damn it! The nine-headed, 13-armed creature turned pale with fright at this moment. At this moment, it couldn't care less about the two-headed snake. It directly changed the direction of its destroyed concept and blasted all of it towards the concept of nothingness around Guei-Shou's body. However, unfortunately, for an existence like Guei-Shou, it simply had no problem at all to travel hundreds of millions of kilometers in an instant. Even though the nine-headed, 13-armed being was only a split second slower, Guei-Shou had already led the beings behind him and traveled hundreds of millions of kilometers away from this place. "It's all your fault," the two-headed snake shouted angrily at this moment. While speaking, it also blasted its softness concept towards Guei-Shou. It wanted to stop Guei-Shou. "I haven't said it's your fault yet." The nine-headed, 13-armed creature was even more furious than the two-headed snake. Although Guei-Shou had already flown hundreds of millions of kilometers away. After all, the attacks of those creatures could also cross such a long distance. Therefore, in the end, he still suffered the bombardment of these two concepts. With a loud bang, he shot off into the distance with the many living beings at an even faster speed. The bombardment of the two concepts on the concept of nothingness around him didn't stop him from moving forward quickly. Instead, it provided him with a strong thrust, causing his body to speed up continuously during this process, even surpassing his limit as he flew into the distance. "Damn it, what have you done?" At this moment, the other creatures who were guarding and preparing to deal with Guei-Shou couldn't help but shout. At this moment, they were all hurriedly attacking Guei-Shou. They kept bombarding him with all kinds of concepts, trying to stop him. However, Guei-Shou's speed was really too fast. In a flash, he had already exceeded their attack range, making their attacks completely miss. When Guei-Shou's figure completely disappeared, they looked at each other in dismay as they watched Guei-Shou's disappearing figure. At this time, if they wanted to deal with Guei-Shou, there was only one way, which was to follow the direction in which Guei-Shou left, find out his destination, and find the most important place where he stayed. All of the living beings here were well aware of this. However, even though they knew this, none of them stood up to chase after him. Even the nine-headed and 13-armed creature and the two-headed snake that were fooled by Guei-Shou didn't do anything. The reason for this? The reason was not complicated. For them, Guei-Shou was just a small fry. What they cared about most was Luo Fan and this civilized country. If they had a chance to kill Guei-Shou, who was obviously on Luo Fan's side, they naturally wouldn't let him go. However, if they had to choose an enemy between Guei-Shou and Luo Fan, they would choose an opponent. Obviously, it would only be Luo Fan. And obviously, if they chased after Guei-Shou now, they would give up on Luo Fan and choose Guei-Shou. Under such circumstances, it would be strange if they chased after Guei-Shou. "If you hadn't interfered, I would have kept him here," the nine-headed and 13-armed creature said lightly. "Humph, you can't deal with him by yourself. Everyone knows this. I was the most suitable person to attack just now. If you hadn't stopped me, How could this have happened? How could the two-headed snake admit such a thing? It shouted angrily. It's because of you two. At this time, the angry voices of the creatures in the distance came. What? Do you want to beat me? The two-headed snake said furiously. The nine-headed and 13-armed creature also looked angrily at the creatures who spoke. Seeing that the two creatures didn't have the slightest intention of repentance, the creatures were all enraged. Immediately, waves of concepts were cast toward the two creatures from all directions. The two creatures roared angrily. With great tacit understanding, they combined the concepts that they had condensed with the help of that inexplicable power and blasted them at the incoming waves. Boom! 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 An earth-shattering tremor exploded at this moment. The entire civilized country trembled slightly at this moment. However, this tremor was similar to the previous tremors. It was also the tremor of the entire civilized country. It didn't really cause any damage to the interior of the entire civilized country, nor did it cause any damage to the creatures in the entire civilized country. After all, the entire civilized country was protected by many false saints. Now, the various factors had already condensed into one. It was unbreakable at this moment. In the palace at the top of the mountain in the center of the civilized country, Luo Fan stopped the suppression concept that he had prepared. This thought flashed through his mind. It seems that Guei Shou has left safely. When he asked Guei Shou to leave the civilized country, he had already considered the creatures who were waiting outside, waiting for an opportunity to destroy this civilized country and kill him. At first, he didn't think that Guei Shou could break through their blockade alone, escape safely, and head to other civilized countries. His original plan was to directly use the suppression concept here, when Guei Shou couldn't take it anymore, and suppress all the creatures for a period of time, allowing Guei Shou to escape safely. He naturally didn't have the ability to use the suppression concept alone to suppress all the creatures. However, after more than 10,000 years of cultivation, his cultivation realm had improved greatly, and his ability to use concepts was also many times stronger than before. Now, he had absolute confidence that he could do this. Although even if he did it, he would only be able to suppress all of them for a few days at most. This period of time should be enough for Guei Shou to escape to the end of the world. It was precisely because he had already considered everything that he dared to let Guei Shou leave directly. Otherwise, why would he send Guei Shou to his death so casually? However, Luo Fan didn't expect that not only had Guei Shou's strength improved so much, but his intelligence had also improved so much. In the process, he didn't need his help at all. He had already escaped with the help of the conflicts between the creatures, which made him look at him in a new light. Chapter 1597. The Guei Shou and the other creatures fled from the encirclement in a panic like stray dogs. In fact, he knew very well that his master, Luo Fan, must have made all kinds of preparations to allow them to escape safely. However, he did not regard this as something to rely on. Instead, he directly ignored all of Luo Fan's support and wholeheartedly tried his best to escape the encirclement. After all, even if Luo Fan protected him, it was obvious that he could not be his babysitter forever. If he did not seize the opportunity to temper himself and improve his strength, what would he do next time he encountered such a situation? It was precisely because of these considerations that he had used this method of using his opponent's attack to escape. As a result, he felt waves of sharp pain all over his body at this moment. Whether it was his power or his life essence, even his connection with that inexplicable place, they were all greatly affected. Even his strength was much weaker than when he was at his peak. Even so, he did not dare to be negligent. Instead, he quickly sped up and headed toward the location that he had sensed inexplicably. It was the location of the other civilized country that belonged to the creature with the innate Taoism aptitude. This civilized country was thousands of light years away from the one where Luo Fan was. Even Guei Shou had spent a few days to bring the many living beings to this location. The moment Guei Shou arrived there, his eyes turned red. This was because he saw hundreds of creatures constantly wreaking havoc in this civilized country. At this moment, the entire civilized country was filled with cries and screams. There was killing and blood everywhere. At a glance, there was almost no place that was healthy or peaceful. As for those creatures, the strongest one was only comparable to the creature behind him that Luo Fan had enlightened with intelligence. As for the others were much weaker than them. In fact, it was precisely because these creatures were not too powerful that the civilized country could survive at this moment. That was why the civilized country was able to hold on at this moment and not be completely destroyed by the attacks of these creatures. That was why it was able to wait for the arrival of the turtle. This civilized country occupied an area with a radius of hundreds of millions of miles. However, compared to the civilized country that Gue Shou was most familiar with, the civilization of this civilized country was obviously much worse. Whether it was the buildings, the clothes of the living beings, the culture created by the many living beings, or the strength of the living beings, they were all far inferior to the civilized country in the center. However, even if it could not be compared, it naturally revealed a sense of rugged beauty, which gave Gue Shou an indescribable sense of intimacy. These are my people. In that instant, Yang Qi's eyes widened. Gue Shou had this thought in his mind. Strictly speaking, the creatures in this civilized country were created by the world and had no direct connection with Gue Shou at all. But the moment Gue Shou saw the creatures in this civilized country, he had an inexplicable feeling. All the living beings in the civilized country gave him a sense of familiarity. It was as if he had an extremely fundamental connection with them. That feeling was no different from the living beings he had created. It was also because of this connection that Gue Shou was so resentful at this moment. In this civilized country, the civilization developed by the many living beings was not too prosperous. At least, from the perspective of cultivation civilization, this was the case. At this moment, the strongest person in the entire civilized country was only at the sage-to-be level. He was not even a false saint, let alone a false saint or a desperate being, who was above the false saint. The reason why they could last until now was that they were united and used the continuous sacrifice of all the people in the country to resist. If that wasn't the case with such power, let alone the hundreds of living beings attacking this country, even a single one of them would be enough to completely destroy this civilized country. The instant Gue Shou arrived, before the living beings in the entire civilized country could see him, they instantly felt an indescribable sense of safety and intimacy surging in their hearts. Some people with sharp senses could even find an inexplicable sense of childish admiration in their hearts. This was the feeling that these living beings had when they met their nominal creator. It was also the feeling brought about by the bond and connection between Gue Shou and them. At this moment, facing the tragic scene in front of him, Gue Shou did not hesitate at all. With a thought, he raised his hand and grabbed the void. In an instant, an indescribable power descended from an inexplicable place. This power kept changing in the void and directly turned into a concept cage of nothingness that sucked in the civilized country. In an instant, the hundreds of living beings that were constantly wreaking havoc in the civilized country seemed to be grabbed by a huge, invisible hand. As they screamed, they crossed the void and directly fell into the concept cage of nothingness. Under the concept of nothingness in the concept cage of nothingness, they were completely assimilated into the concept of nothingness. In the blink of an eye, they were all dead, their souls scattered, and they completely disappeared from this world. That extremely straightforward performance made people truly understand how powerful and terrifying the concept of nothingness was. Even Gue Shou could not help but feel inexplicably happy for his concept of nothingness at this moment. After all, ever since he had been able to convert power into concepts, all the opponents he had encountered were existences that could do the same. The power of such existences was needless to say. In front of them, the concept of nothingness that he had just grasped was at most on par with their concepts. In battle, When he used his concept, it was almost always easily blocked by his opponents. Moreover, due to haste and other reasons, his opponents would even seize the opportunity to counterattack. Under such circumstances, although he clearly knew that the power of transforming power into concepts would become extremely terrifying, there was no evidence to prove this. Until now, he had casually used the concept cage of nothingness to easily deal with hundreds of living beings that he originally had to spend a lot of effort to deal with. Only then did he truly realize that after transforming power into concepts, its power would actually increase to this extent. Because of this discovery, the anger he felt when he saw the many living beings wreaking havoc in the civilized country and his people being slaughtered by hundreds of living beings suddenly diminished a lot. After transforming this power into a concept, although Gue Sho still had no way to transform this concept as he pleased like Luo Fan, he already had the ability to divide the power and condense this concept at will. Therefore, he already had the ability to divide the power at will, disperse this concept, and condense it at will. Therefore, at this moment, with a slight thought, he had directly erased the concept cage of nothingness, making it disappear without a trace. In this process, however, it did not cause his ability to guide the inexplicable power to cool down and be unable to be used. After doing all this, Gue Sho sighed. With a light step, he arrived above the civilized country. With a thought, his figure appeared in front of all the living beings in the entire civilized country. Although this civilized country was tens of thousands of times smaller than the civilized country that Luo Fan was in and had the protection of a false saint, it was still tens of thousands of times smaller. However, in terms of absolute size, this civilized country was still as wide as hundreds of millions of miles. With such a wide distance, if Gue Sho did not use this method, standing here, the only living beings that could see him were probably the living beings within a few miles of him. At this moment, all the living beings in this civilized country felt an indescribable feeling surge from their hearts. For a moment, almost all the living beings had tears streaming down their faces. They did not even need any prompts. They all knelt to Gue Sho and said while choking with sobs, "Greetings, Creator! Thank you, Creator, for saving us." When Gue Sho heard such a grand and sincere voice, he could not help but show a look of shame on his face. "Get up. I came too late, and that's why you guys suffered so much." His voice was not loud. However, it directly spread throughout the entire civilized country, allowing all the living beings in this civilized country to hear his voice in an instant. The moment they heard his voice, all the living beings cried nonstop. For a moment, their hearts were filled with grievances, joy, happiness, excitement, and various other emotions almost at the same time. Under this kind of emotion, they couldn't say anything and could only kneel down and kowtow to the turtle. At this moment, Gue Sho had an inexplicable hidden worry in his heart. This place is so close, and it's already so tragic. Won't the other countries that are further away be even more tragic? Thinking of this, he suddenly felt that he could not continue to stay here. However, although he felt a sense of urgency to leave and go to other countries, he obviously could not leave as he wished. After all, this civilized country was still in chaos, and he still needed to deal with it. With a thought, he raised his hand and waved it gently. All the countless living beings felt an inexplicable vast power appear out of thin air, directly lifting all of them up. "In 3 days I will speak about the Tao. Those who are fated can come and listen." As he spoke, he waved his hand casually. Between the normal space-time of this civilized country and that inexplicable place, a layer of strange existence appeared out of thin air. And in this layer of strange existence, an island appeared out of thin air. It was an island that looked exactly the same as the island he created in the civilized country when he was preaching to the many living beings and the fake sage. Immediately afterward, he led the living beings behind him and directly stepped onto the island, directly appearing at the place where he was originally sitting, and closed his eyes to wait quietly. The sudden disappearance of the turtle lifespan caused all the beings in the kingdom to feel a sense of loss. However, very soon, they discovered that there was an inexplicable feeling in their hearts, as if there was some kind of inexplicable guidance pointing them to a certain location. Recalling what Gue Sho said before, they all understood that that location must be the so-called place where he would preach about the Tao. After Gue Sho sat on the island, with a thought, he sensed something. He immediately summoned 2 living beings that had been following him and said to them, "The 2 of you, go kill the living beings in that location, then come back and reply." As he spoke, he casually pointed at the void, and an image appeared, which marked a mountain range tens of millions of miles away from the civilized country. Those 2 living beings were intelligent living beings that Luo Fan had enlightened. Although they were much worse than living beings that were born with intelligence, compared to the living beings that were not born with intelligence in this world, they were much stronger. With their strength, it would be easy for one of them to deal with the living beings in the mountain range alone, not to mention 2 of them. The 2 living beings hurriedly responded. In the beginning, they only followed Gue Sho because of Luo Fan's order, and they did not have a strong sense of identity with Gue Sho. But after this period of experience, after seeing how Gue Sho created a bloody path through the encirclement of many living beings, and how easily Gue Sho dealt with hundreds of living beings that were only slightly weaker than them, their sense of identity with him soared like a rocket. By now, they had almost regarded Gue Sho as an existence that was second only to Luo Fan. Naturally, they did not dare to neglect his orders. After they agreed, they quickly headed toward the mountain range. After sending them out, Gue Sho did not hesitate and casually pointed them out. One creature after another was summoned by him. Following that, he also gave instructions one by one, letting them head to various locations around the civilized country and kill the living beings there in various directions. Just like that, not long after, only half of the living beings there were left. There were hundreds of places around the civilized country that originally had hidden dangers. Among them, there were living beings that could threaten the civilized country. He had already sent living beings to eliminate them. Gue Sho's current strength was already not much different from those living beings that were second only to the supreme leaders of the big organizations. Under such circumstances, although he had only raised his eyes to look inside and outside of the civilized country, he had already gained a deep understanding of the situation inside and outside of the civilized country. He had a clear understanding of the powerful beings hiding in the surroundings of the civilized country, as well as which beings had ill intentions towards the civilized country and which ones had no ill intentions towards it. Those living beings that he was currently targeting were living beings that had malicious intentions towards the civilized country. As most of the living beings left, gradually, more and more living beings began to appear on this island. The way they appeared was the same as in another civilized country. Those beings who had gone to listen to the Longevity Turtle's Tao lecture had all appeared in the same way. They had also walked and appeared here. After these living beings appeared, they could not see Gue Sho either. They were also attracted by the patterns on the square and wholeheartedly immersed themselves in it. They began to diligently study and comprehend the mysteries within. Compared to another civilized country that had a complete and prosperous cultivation civilization, the living beings in this civilized country behaved completely differently. Because they did not have a complete and prosperous cultivation civilization, their knowledge of cultivation was quite poor. Therefore, they were more immersed in comprehending these patterns than the living beings in another civilized country, and they gained more. Even before Gue Sho began a lecture about the Great Tao, some living beings had already comprehended some key points of cultivation from the square and directly began to break through their realms. The number of such living beings continued to increase as the number of living beings increased. 3 days later, when there were already hundreds of millions of living beings in the square, the number of such living beings had already reached over 1 million. This number was simply unbelievable. Gue Sho looked at the scene in front of him and sighed. He directly appeared in front of the many living beings. Immediately after, without any nonsense or small talk, he began to talk about the principles of cultivation from guiding qi into his body. This time, due to the urgency of time, he did not intend to lecture for too long. Therefore, during the lecture, he used a method to greatly increase the acceptance of the many living beings of the content he was talking about. However, even so, he still talked for a total of 99 days before he finally talked about the method to become a false saint. As for what happened after that, he did not say anything about how to cultivate and improve after becoming a false saint. It was not that he cherished his knowledge. It was because he clearly knew that there was no point in talking about those things anymore. Putting everything else aside, just the cultivation method after the false saint that he talked about later on, and the method to become a false saint was obviously something that not many living beings could understand. Almost every living being could only memorize the contents of Gu Shou's lecture with great difficulty. Under such circumstances, was there any need for him to talk about the cultivation method after becoming a true saint? When Gu Shou stopped lecturing, the many living beings no longer felt as if they were unsatisfied. On the contrary, every living being heaved a long sigh of relief. The words, "It's finally over," were almost directly written on their faces. Anyone could tell what they were thinking at a glance. These living beings could not be blamed for this, although they were extremely clear that listening to Gu Shou's lecture would be a great opportunity for them. It was enough to establish their future cultivation foundation. Listening to any more words might reduce many obstacles they would encounter in their future cultivation process. However, knowing was one thing. The strongest among them was only at the quasi-saint level. They could still roughly listen to the cultivation of the false saint level. After careful thinking and careful research, they could still understand. However, as for how to prove one's Tao and become a false saint, how to increase one's chances of becoming a false saint, the taboo of becoming a false saint, and so on, those are simply heavenly books. Just the memory alone was already a burden for them. In that case, how could they not heave a sigh of relief when Gu Shou finally stopped lecturing? Although, after heaving a sigh of relief, they all felt extremely ashamed in the process of these 99 days of lecturing. The living beings that Gu Shou sent out had already returned one after another. The many areas outside this civilized country that were dangerous to this civilized country had also been completely wiped out during this process. In other words, for the time being, this civilized country, all the hidden dangers that could lead to its eventual destruction had been eliminated. After discovering this, Gu Shou was finally relieved. After that, he directly pointed out the two living beings that he had sent out at the beginning and said to them, "From today onwards, the two of you will stay here and protect this country. I will let the living beings of this country worship you. All you have to do is help this country survive when it encounters danger that they can't resist." The two living beings were obviously a little unwilling. Although they wanted to make contributions for the new protagonist of this world, it did not mean that they were willing to be tied to this civilized country. After all, the pursuit of freedom was the nature of all living beings. You don't have to be unwilling. You must know that this country is the new protagonist of this world. With their worship, you will also have the status of a protagonist of this world. When that time comes, there will naturally be endless benefits. You will know this in the future. When that time comes, you might even have to thank me for letting you stay here, Gu Shou said calmly when he saw that they were unwilling. Although these living beings had to obey his forceful orders, they were protecting this country after all. Of course, the more active they were, the better. It's not that we don't want to, but we are so weak. What if we encounter enemies that we can't resist? One of the living beings said hesitantly, "When that time comes, you just need to inform me, and then you can leave on your own," Gu Shou said. Hearing this, the two living beings nodded. Seeing that they nodded, Gu Shou waved his hand and made them appear. They directly appeared in front of the hundreds of millions of living beings in this civilized country. Among these two living beings, one looked like a ferocious white tiger. Its entire body gave off an extremely vigorous and powerful aura. It stood there like a powerful divine beast that could overturn the universe. The other looked like an extremely gorgeous bird. This bird's entire body was surrounded by a faint frost aura, but it felt so cold, so noble, and so sacred. It was also like a powerful divine beast. Compared to the many living beings that had attacked this civilized country before, the light of wisdom in their eyes completely distinguished the two. No one would confuse them with those living beings. Chapter 1598. The Gui Sho said to the many creatures, "These two are my friends and can be the guardian divine beasts of the nation. As long as you don't forget to worship them, they will always protect this nation." Hearing this, the many creatures were in an uproar. Whether it was a divine beast or not, the Gui Sho's words clearly meant that it was going to leave soon. For the many cultivators in this civilized nation who originally thought that the Gui Shos would stay here to protect them, the feeling was self-evident. To them, this moment was like a calamity falling from the sky. At this moment, the two creatures pointed out by the Gui Sho released their auras. In an instant, an extremely powerful aura that could even distort the void directly descended on this island. Along with this momentum, the entire island began to emit cracking sounds. It felt as if something inside the island was shattering. At the same time, the entire island began to tremble slightly. This extremely shocking scene caused all the cultivators listening to the Tao to involuntarily stop chattering. They all looked at the two beings in the sky with a mixture of shock and fear. Although the two creatures did not give them a good look, they all felt an inexplicable sense of security at this moment. Although the two creatures were clearly weaker than the Gui Sho, they were many times stronger than them. With their protection, the safety of this civilized nation would not be much weaker than the Gui Shos. Compared to the situation where they had no one to rely on, the situation was many times better. Seeing the changes in the expressions of the many creatures, the two creatures withdrew their auras. The Gui Sho quietly appeared in the void again. Its eyes, filled with wisdom, seemed to be staring at every cultivator. Seeing that the two creatures had settled the matter, the Gui Sho nodded and said, "That's it. You all have to cultivate well from now on. In the future, if you meet creatures that have the same appearance as you, that is your own race. That is your own race. You must unite them closely. Go." With that said, with a wave of his hand, all the cultivators on the island who were listening to him were instantly sent away from the island. They appeared at the place where they were before they entered the island. After they left, the Gui Sho said to the two creatures that he had arranged to stay. He said, "Protecting this country is related to your future. You must not neglect it." The two living beings naturally understood the importance of this. In fact, when the many living beings acknowledged them as the guardian divine beasts of this civilized country, they already had an inexplicable feeling. It was as if their connection with the world had become closer than before. How could he dare to ignore Gui Sho's words? He quickly said, "We understand." Gui Sho nodded and said to the other living beings, "We still have many other places to go. We can't delay any longer. Let's go." As he spoke, he soared into the sky. He turned into a streak of light and left the island, heading in the direction of the other civilized country that he sensed was located. The other living beings bade farewell to the ones who stayed. Then they also turned into escape lights and flew away in the direction of Gui Sho. In the following long period of time, the Gui Sho and these creatures were like this time. He traveled from one country to another. Of course, not all of these countries were the same as the first one they encountered. They happened to be in an abyss of suffering and could be destroyed at any time. Most of them were still in a state of impending danger. However, no matter if they were being attacked or were about to be attacked, the Gui Sho just pushed them away. After coming here, he directly blended his aura with the living beings in this country. Then he directly sent many living beings to various places around the country to eliminate the living beings that might pose a threat to this country. After temporarily eliminating the future troubles of this country, he directly preached in those countries, imparted the perfect cultivation system, and tried his best to guide the cultivators in those civilized countries to improve their cultivation realm. After that, just like the first country, he left behind 2 cultivators that he brought to serve as the guardian divine beasts of that civilized country. Then he left that civilized country for another purpose. In this way, in just a short 1,000 years, there are no more living beings around a Gui show. All the living beings have been left in those civilized countries by him to serve as the guardian divine beasts of those countries. And even so, the area that he had traveled had not even stepped out of the area controlled by the big organizations. In other words, he had not left a very small corner of this world. In other words, there were even more civilized countries waiting for him outside the countries that he had traveled to. This won't do. If I don't leave any living beings to guard the country, there will still be living beings after I leave, even if I eliminate all the dangers around the country. At that time, the country will still be in great danger. On this day, when the Gui show finished preaching, such a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Before coming to this civilized country, he had already left all the living beings that had been enlightened with intelligence in the various countries. According to his original plan, he should have left directly after he finished preaching and no longer cared about this civilized country in front of him. However, when things came to a head, when he was really about to leave, he suddenly felt that it was inappropriate to do so. Although this civilized country already had great potential after he preached here for nearly 100 days, and there was a high possibility that a false saint would appear. However, that would take time after all. There would definitely be a rather long period of time before the false saint guarding this country appeared. During this period of time, the entire civilized country was as fragile as tofu. If something were to go wrong, and some beings that were slightly more powerful than the ordinary beings in the world came here, the entire civilized nation would be completely destroyed in a single night. All living beings would die. At that time, no matter how great their potential was, what was the point? The Gui show thought about it, but in the end, he could not leave this civilized country here and let it fend for itself. Perhaps I should also enlighten some living beings to serve as the guardian divine beasts of the country. With this thought in mind, his heart stirred. His figure had already disappeared from the island. During the entire process, not a single cultivator noticed his departure. In the eyes of the many cultivators, the Gui show was still sitting there cross-legged, still spitting out Tao sounds one after another, shaking their minds. It shook the essence of their lives, allowing them to constantly comprehend some inexplicable and mysterious cultivation principles. After the Gui show left the island, he carefully sensed and confirmed his target. With a thought, he came to a vast lake that was hundreds of billions of light years away from the civilized country. The lake was so vast that it was probably more than enough to place the entire civilized country that he had just left. The lake water in the lake was also not ordinary lake water, but a product condensed and transformed by a kind of true saint mystery in an inexplicable way. It was extremely beneficial to the cultivation of any living being. Obviously, to be able to occupy such a lake, the living beings in the lake must be extremely powerful. The creature in the lake must be extremely powerful. Otherwise, it would be impossible for it to escape the covetous eyes of the other creatures. They would guarantee that this lake belonged to them. When the Gui show arrived, he did not stand on ceremony at all. He released his aura and directly pressed down on the lake. At this moment, a series of earth-shattering roars rang out from the lake. There were all kinds of voices, and although their strengths were different, however, all of them were shocking. Immediately after, figures rushed out of the lake one after another. They floated in midair and roared at the Gui show. Looking at the thousands of densely packed creatures, the Gui show showed a satisfied expression. The reason why he chose this lake was not only that the creatures in the lake were extremely powerful, but more importantly, although the creatures in the lake were more powerful than ordinary creatures with innate wisdom, they did not have innate wisdom. In other words, among the thousands of creatures in the lake, none of them had the ability to think completely. In comparison, this was much more important than their strength. After all, If the Gui show had the ability to think completely, he could not guarantee that these creatures would regard him as the supreme being if he enlightened them. This was obviously a devastating blow to the Gui show's plan of placing these creatures in the civilized countries to help them resist dangers and protect them. In fact, if it were not for this harsh requirement, why would the Gui show come to this place that was hundreds of billions of light years away? Within this area of hundreds of billions of miles, there were tens of thousands of places where living beings gathered like this one for him to choose from. Which of them was not closer than this one? After discovering that these creatures were indeed as he had imagined, the Gui show no longer hesitated. With a thought, he opened his mouth and spat out Tao sound one by one. These Tao sounds seeped into the void and passed through the void to the hearts of each creature, constantly shaking them. Gradually, these creatures' minds and life essences began to gradually merge with the Tao sounds he spat out. At this moment, faint thunderclaps came from the void. These thunderclaps were extremely oppressive and shocking. After they spread down, every creature above the lake could not help but tremble slightly. At this moment, the Gui show had an inexplicable feeling. It was as if he had suddenly been rejected by the entire world, as if the entire world was gathering a powerful attack to erase him. As expected, it's not a simple matter to enlighten a creature without intelligence. Such a thought flashed through Gui show's mind at this moment. With this thought, he began to admire Luo Fan even more for being able to easily enlighten so many creatures. After all, back then, Luo Fan inadvertently enlightened so many creatures. Moreover, the entire process was extremely easy, and he did not encounter any difficulties at all. Now, the Gui show wanted to enlighten these creatures. Before he could make any decisive progress, such a change had already occurred in this world. It was already threatening him, wanting him to stop. However, the Gui show was many times stronger than before. This kind of threat that could make him tremble and not even dare to move in the slightest in the past. He only paid a little attention to it. He directly tossed it aside and continued with his previous plan. The Tao sound from his mouth. In fact, compared to before, they became even more concentrated. These Tao voices were so mysterious and unbelievable. After they entered the bodies of the thousands of living beings, they resonated strongly with the essence of their lives. As they resonated, these creatures gradually emitted all kinds of inexplicable fluctuations. These fluctuations were based on the creature's own strength, but the power they emitted was not something the creature's own strength could compare with. Under these fluctuations, the space around the creatures seemed to be separated from the outside world, as if it was about to become an independent entity. An aura that did not belong to this world was gradually emitted from it. Following the appearance of this change, the thunderous roar that came from the void became even louder and more shocking. Vaguely, there were pitch-black clouds gradually gathering in the void. Between those clouds, one could even see wisps of lightning flashing within them. Suddenly, at a certain moment, the pitch-black clouds above the void shook slightly. A bolt of lightning fell from the sky, directly landing on the Gui show's head. In an instant, the Gui show felt as if his body was being crushed by the whole world. He felt as if his whole body was about to collapse and explode into countless pieces. So strong. How could the Gui show dare to be careless at this time? In an instant, he quickly released the power condensed in his body, directly forming a concept cage of nothingness, directly wrapping himself within. With the appearance of the concept cage of nothingness, the lightning that struck down from above the void was directly disintegrated by the concept cage of nothingness, turning into a concept of nothingness out of thin air. It would no longer cause any damage to him. The moment this change was completed, the Gui show felt his body lighten, and even the powerful pressure from above the void had disappeared without a trace. Even so, it was clearly not the time for him to completely relax. The world seemed to be provoked, and it began to strike down again and again, hitting the concept cage of nothingness around his body, causing waves of ripples in the concept cage of nothingness. It looked as if one stone after another was thrown into the concept cage of nothingness during this entire process. The Tao voice from the Gui Shou's mouth did not stop at all. It was still as stable as before, and it was still effective on the many living beings. At this moment, although the many living beings were not restrained, they had stopped struggling and looking at the Gui Shou with hatred. In each of their eyes, there was an existence that they had never had before, and it was slowly being derived bit by bit. That was wisdom. It was also the emergence of this wisdom that made these living beings instinctively feel close to the Gui Shou, even though they had not yet reached the stage where they could clearly understand how much price the Gui Shou had paid to achieve all of this. As time passed, the lightning that struck down from above the void became more and more concentrated, and the power also became greater and greater. But no matter how much the power increased, the Gui Shou was able to withstand it rather easily. In other words, the concept cage of nothingness around the Gui Shou's body easily withstood it, and it did not even cause much shock to its body. In fact, at this moment, the Gui Shou was already completely at ease. This was because he could clearly feel that although the lightning was constantly striking down from above, no matter how much the power of the lightning increased, no matter how concentrated they became, it was still far from the tribulation of form transformation that he had encountered back then. It could be said that, even if the power of the tens of thousands of lightning bolts that he had endured from the beginning were all added up, it could not compare to any of the lightning bolts that he had encountered back then. With such power, even if he was still at the level when he had just undergone form transformation, he would not be in any danger. Not to mention, the current him was at least tens of thousands of times stronger than before. Under such circumstances, why would he need to worry about the lightning that descended from the void? The Gui Shou let out the Tao voice for 3 days and 3 nights, and the lightning that struck down from above also lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. In the end, the lightning that struck down from above the void was so dense that it was completely connected. It no longer looked like bolts of lightning descending from the sky. Instead, there was a lightning pillar piercing down from the clouds above, directly connecting to the concept cage of nothingness around his body. And at this moment, in front of him, the wisdom in the eyes of the many creatures above the lake had unknowingly risen to an extremely impressive level. Even now, Gui Shou, on the other hand, was already able to observe many complicated emotions and thoughts from the intelligence. After carefully distinguishing them and discovering that almost every creature had complete wisdom, the Gui Shou nodded and closed his mouth to stop the Tao voice that had been constantly spewing out. As the Tao voice stopped, the lightning pillar that pierced down from the clouds above the void instantly disappeared, and the clouds above the void also collapsed in an instant. They directly turned invisible. It was also at this moment that the fluctuation that was generated by the Tao voice around the bodies of the many creatures that had completely isolated them from the outside world also completely dissipated. It caused those creatures to instantly return to their normal appearances. In comparison, only the wisdom in their eyes could distinguish them from the past. The many creatures seemed to have woken up from a dream at this moment, and they all knelt to the Gui Shou in midair, thanking their master for enlightening them. As for why they called the Gui Shou their master, it was because their wisdom was formed by the Gui Shou, so they naturally had inexplicable feelings for the Gui Shou. The Gui Shou looked at them. However, he was secretly delighted. He knew clearly that from now on, he no longer needed to worry about the guardian divine beasts of the civilized countries that he was about to walk on. He smiled and said, "No need to be so polite, come with me." As he spoke, he turned into a ray of light and flew into the distance. Even if those living beings were ordinary living beings in this world, their strength had already reached the false sage level. It could even be said that compared to those creatures that were born with wisdom, their wisdom was inferior, and they could not guide the inexplicable power to descend. Under such circumstances, the birth of wisdom had already made up for one of the 2 shortcomings, and they were completely qualified to serve as the guardian divine beasts of the various civilized countries. Those creatures were so powerful, so it was naturally not a problem for them to catch up to the Gui Shou. Very soon, they arrived at the civilized country that he had been preaching at with the Gui show at an extremely fast speed in their own ways. They also followed the Gui show into the island. From his departure until his return, the many cultivators on the island did not change at all. To them, Gui show had always been there, always preaching to them, always imparting all sorts of incredible cultivation principles to them. The Gui show had been preaching here for more than 100 days, but he should have left a few days ago. However, because of these living creatures that he had just enlightened, the Gui show could only continue to stay here and start from the beginning. Right now, he was not preaching to the cultivators in this civilized country, but to the living creatures that he had enlightened and prepared to be placed in this civilized country as guardian divine beasts. Although the strength of these living creatures was already quite impressive, the methods they used were too crude, and their potential was still at an extremely low level. Gui show was not at ease to use them to protect this civilized country. Of course, after all, the foundation of these living creatures was worlds apart from the foundation of the cultivators in the civilized country. Therefore, the Gui show did not give a detailed lecture like the first time. Instead, he only talked about the key cultivation principles. As for some of the minor details that these living creatures had already mastered, he only briefly mentioned them. Chapter 1599. Fawn, color equals red, squinting eyes face. The many living beings who had just been enlightened by the Gui show naturally made great progress in these 9 days. This allowed them to truly establish the concept of cultivation, allowing them to gradually control their innate abilities. They began to develop countless methods that exceeded their original abilities according to their own conditions and abilities. In this way, in less than 10 days, their strength had increased by several times compared to before. Moreover, not only had their strength increased, but their control over their own strength had also reached a level that was several times stronger than before. The specific manifestation was that if they wanted to kill a living being before, there was a great possibility that a large area around the living being would be destroyed at the same time due to the leakage of power. But now, this was not the case. Now, they could only kill whatever they wanted to kill. There would not be many battle aftershocks that would damage the surroundings. The many living beings had such great gains, and the cultivators who belonged to this civilized country who listened to the Gui show's Tao preaching also had great gains. After all, listening to the Gui show's Tao preaching once was obviously not enough for them to completely grasp the various principles that the Gui show preached. Relatively speaking, listening to the Gui show's Tao preaching again was not as detailed as the last time, but it was enough for them to comprehend it again. Thus, they could solve the various problems that they encountered last time, allowing them to comprehend more mysteries from the principles that the Gui show preached. After 9 days, when the Gui show stopped preaching, the many cultivators all bowed to the Gui show with great gratitude. They were already very grateful to listen to the Gui show preaching once, but now the Gui show actually preached twice. It was self-evident how much care he had for them. The Gui show did not pay attention to their understanding. Just like before, he casually pointed out 2 of the living beings he enlightened and directly announced to the many living beings that they were the guardian divine beasts of this country. He asked them to worship them and also asked them to protect this civilized country. The living beings who were enlightened by the Gui show had an inexplicable childlike affection for the Gui show. They almost did not ask the reason for the Gui show's orders, nor did they ask what benefits it would bring them. They had already agreed. As for the cultivators of the civilized nations, they were even more grateful and immediately greeted the guardian divine beast of the kingdom. After busying himself for a while, he decided on his identity. As a result, the 2 of them instantly sensed that their connection with heaven and earth seemed to have changed. With this improvement, he instantly understood Gui show's intention of making such arrangements. He could not help but feel even more grateful to Gui show. Seeing that everything had been arranged, Gui show was no longer in the mood to stay here. He immediately sent the cultivators in the civilized countries back to where they came from, and he wanted to continue to another civilized country with the thousands of living beings that he had enlightened. Just as he was about to move, he suddenly sensed something and let out a soft cry. With a wave of his hand, an inexplicable power descended from an inexplicable place, directly forming a void concept cage in front of him. It blasted towards the void in front of it. At this moment, a shrill shriek rang out from the void ahead. Soon after, the air trembled, and an incredibly powerful force erupted from above. This force was so strong that it even completely crushed the strange existence that Guay Shou had constructed. It even instantly destroyed the island that Guay Shou and the others were on. In the blink of an eye, only the small part of the island that Guay Shou and the others were standing on was still intact. "You actually dared to peep, come out," Guay Shou coldly shouted. As he shouted coldly, the concept cage of nothingness he had sent out rotated slightly and suddenly produced a strange power that sucked in the place where the impact came from. In an instant, an extremely powerful existence descended from a void. It was a living being. It looked like a human, but was a bit strange. It was only half the height of a human, and its eyes flickered with a strong light of wisdom. This living being was bleeding all over, and its power surged frantically, doing its best to resist the invasion of the void concept cage around it. From this, it could be seen how powerful this living being was. Without using the power that was summoned and guided from an unknown place, it could resist the invasion of the void concept cage with just its own power. Even if Luo Fan saw this, he would not be able to help but exclaim in admiration. At this moment, this living being was full of panic, and it said, "Creator, spare me, spare me, Creator." Guay Shou frowned and said, "Who are you? Why do you call me Creator?" Hearing this, the living being's eyes were filled with confusion, and it said, "I don't know what I am. Aren't you called Creator?" Hearing this, Guay Shou frowned even more deeply. He did not sense his own aura from this living being at all. He was sure that this living being had absolutely nothing to do with him, and it was definitely not created by him. "Answer me seriously. Why are you hiding at the side? Do you have bad intentions?" No. I'm just listening to the Tao. It's just that I can't find the way. That's why I'm hiding here. I don't have evil intentions. I don't have evil intentions." This creature cried out in panic. Guay Shou's eyes flashed with understanding. With a slight thought, the void concept cage stopped crushing and eroding it, but did not disappear completely. Instead, it directly hid in his body, ready to be released at any time. Although this living being seemed to be only a little stronger than the living beings he had enlightened, and it did not seem to be much of a threat to him, it was, after all, a living being of unknown origin and identity. It was never wrong to be careful. After putting away the void concept cage, he casually waved his hand. With a wave of his hand, the destroyed island reappeared, and the layer of strange existence between the normal space-time and the ineffable place was instantly regenerated. Everything looked exactly the same as before. After everything was restored, he said, "Come here and tell me where you came from." The living being was very obedient. Hearing Guay Shou's words, it came not far from Guay Shou, bowed down, and said, "I don't know where I came from. When I was conscious, I was already listening to the voice of my Creator. This voice led me and made me follow the voice in a daze for hundreds of years. Until just now, I suddenly woke up as if I had just woken up from a dream. I got rid of that dazed state and came here." Hearing this, Guay Shou could not help but be more curious. The origin of this living being was beyond his imagination. He originally thought that something had been attracted by his sermon, but it turned out that it was a creature near this kingdom. He did not expect that he had only guessed part of it correctly. This creature was indeed attracted by his sermon, but it was not a creature near this kingdom. Instead, it might be a creature near the kingdom he had been in thousands of times before he had given his sermon. It might even be a living being stimulated by his preaching. After that, it just chased after him in a daze and kept moving with him. It kept going around one country after another. From this aspect, it did not seem inappropriate for it to call itself a creator. As for whether this living being was lying or not, After going to so many civilized countries and seeing so many living beings, Gui Shou believed that he could see it clearly. Since you were born for my preaching, then follow me from now on. From now on, follow me, Gui Shou said after making up his mind. Hearing this, the living being could not help but be overjoyed and said, "Thank you, Creator, for your help." Gui Shou nodded, then frowned and said, "You must have wanted to condense the innate Tao constitution but couldn't find a template, so you condensed this nondescript appearance, right?" "That's right." That living being was rather ashamed. Gui Shou thought for a while and said, "In that case, I'll ask first to see if I can teach you the template of the innate Tao constitution." As he spoke, without waiting for the living being to kneel and thank him, he closed his eyes. His mind slowly followed some kind of inexplicable connection and was transmitted to a country countless light years away. Through the mind of a powerful false saint, he transmitted his will over. In that instant, he felt his mind directly traverse an endless distance and arrive in a strange world. This was the mind of that false saint. What he was doing now was obviously using some kind of inseparable connection between himself and the living beings he had created that could transcend the barriers of time and space to allow his mind to traverse a distance that was difficult for him to traverse and return to the civilized country in the center. While the fake saint was cultivating, he suddenly felt a supreme figure appear in his heart. With a jolt of his heart, he instantly knew what was going on. He did not dare to delay and gathered his power into that figure, taking the opportunity to transfer that figure out of his heart. In an instant, Gui Shou's figure had already left his mind and appeared directly in front of the false saint. This method looked like he had directly sent a projection here, but in reality, the situation was completely different. It was not difficult for the current Gui Shou to create a projection. However, in this incomparably mysterious world, it was almost impossible for his projection to cross such a long distance to come here. At this moment, the figure was indeed Gui Shou, but it was just a fake body formed by the power of the false saint that he had entrusted his mind to. In other words, the foundation of this body was actually this false saint. As long as there was any problem with the false saint, regardless of whether the mind of this body was Gui Shou's mind or not, regardless of how much stronger Gui Shou's mind was compared to the false saint, it would definitely collapse and be destroyed. However, using such a transfer had already solved the problem that Gui Shou was too far away from this location, so he could not quickly come here to ask Luo Fan. The false saint directly bowed to Gui Shou. Gui Shou did not waste any time talking to him, and only said that he had come here for something. He told him that there was no need for him to be so polite, then turned around and stepped out of the cave abode. This cave abode was a small world. Under normal circumstances, even if other false saints came here, it would probably be difficult for them to break through easily, and it would be impossible for them to come and go as they pleased. However, this was naturally not the case for Gui Shou. Not only did Gui Shou's identity prevent the false saint from restricting him from entering and leaving, but Gui Shou's own strength was also many times stronger than that of the false saint. Therefore, even if this cave abode was restricted by the false saint, it was just a matter of a thought for Gui Shou. After leaving this small world, Gui Shou directly controlled the fake body and came to the hall where Luo Fan was, directly stepping into the hall. At this moment, Luo Fan was still cultivating with his eyes closed. There was an inexplicable aura surrounding his body. It was a charm that no one could remember after seeing it. Gui Shou could not help but be shocked when he saw it. Gui Shou did not say anything. Luo Fan had already sensed his arrival. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at Gui Shou. In an instant, he had already seen through Gui Shou's current state and nodded slightly. It was quite ingenious to be able to think of such a method to send his mind back. The fact that he could think of this proved that Gui Shou had already made great progress in the use of his own abilities. "Greetings, Master." Gui Shou bowed first. Luo Fan faintly said that there was no need for formalities, then said, "You're not preaching everywhere. What are you doing here?" Gui Shou did not dare to delay and hurriedly told him everything about that living being. In the end, he even told him about his idea of teaching that living being the innate Tao aptitude template. After hearing this, Luo Fan pondered for a while before sighing and saying, I didn't expect there to be such a living being. There are really many strange things in the world. With one look, Guisho knew that the living being probably had a great background. He could not help but ask, May I ask, Master, what is the origin of that living being? It is the fate of the country, Luo Fan said with a smile. The fate of the country. Guisho was secretly shocked. Something like the fate of the country. He had never heard of it before, but this was the first time he had heard of it. From this name, he could already feel the lingering charm within it. That's right, it's not a natural creature of this world. It is a living being condensed from the fate of the countries where you preach. In essence, it is very different from the natural living beings in this world. As for the fate of the country, it is the fate of the country and the fate of all living beings. In essence, it is closely related to the whole country and all the living beings in the country, Luo Fan said with a smile. So, it is like this. How can the fate of the country become a living being? Guisho was shocked. Come to think of it, you left the divine beast guarding the country to share the pressure of these countries, so that the fate of these countries became more and more intense. In the end, it broke through a certain limit and naturally gave birth to spiritual intelligence, turning into a living being, Luo Fan said with a smile. Guisho's expression changed when he heard this, and he said, Then, this living being is by my side now. If it leaves those countries, won't it affect them? Luo Fan shook his head and said, Of course not. It is a good thing that it is by your side, not a bad thing. Those countries are scattered. Even if you go to them and teach them the great Tao, they're independent of each other and can't be considered as a whole, let alone integrate their power. But now, with their kingdom fates by your side, they have fused into one. All of the kingdoms have naturally become one. They integrate with each other and complement each other. In the future, as long as one country is not destroyed, one or two countries will be destroyed, and they will have a chance to rise again because of the supplement from other countries. This, however, is an extremely good thing. Guisho heaved a sigh of relief. With Luo Fan's words, he was completely relieved. However, don't be careless. Since that living being is the manifestation of the fate of the country, its life and death are naturally connected to the fate of the country. If it grows, the fate of the country will naturally grow. But if it is killed one day, then the fate of those countries will instantly plummet, and it will be difficult to recover. You must remember this, Luo Fan warned. Guisho's expression became solemn, and he said, I will definitely remember this. Since you understand, then go. With your current realm, I think you already know what method you need to give it to cultivate and what method you need to use to nurture it. I won't say more, Luo Fan said lightly. Guisho didn't dare to delay any longer. He hurriedly bowed and said his goodbyes. Then his mind directly separated from the fake body in front of Luo Fan, using that inexplicable connection. With the help of that inexplicable connection, he instantly returned to his original body that was billions of light years away. As his consciousness left the fake body, it instantly collapsed and directly turned into traces of invisible power, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. After Guisho left, Luo Fan sighed. What are you two doing outside instead of working hard to cultivate? As soon as he finished speaking, at the entrance of the hall, Qing Yi and Yu Zhi's figures appeared. At this time, the two of them looked a little wronged. In the end, it was Yu Zhi who stepped forward. She bowed and said, Guisho has become so strong now, but the two of us are still making no progress. I hope that master can point out a bright path for us. Qing Yi also bowed at the side. She didn't say anything, but just looked at Luo Fan with burning eyes. Usually, Yu Zhi was more fluent in making such requests. Compared to Yu Zhi, Qing Yi was more intelligent, so it was not easy for her to say such things. However, regardless of whether they said it or not, there was not much difference in their thoughts. Hearing this, Luo Fan sighed helplessly and said, What do you want? We also want to become as strong, as Gui Shou. Yuji said directly. Have the two of your worlds been reinforced? Yes. It had been fortified many years ago. Now that we are gone, these worlds can safely exist. But that's not right. But this seems to be meaningless, Yuji said. Luo Fan shook his head and said, How is it meaningless? Don't think that these worlds are safe just because they are in the center of the country. It is more dangerous here than in other places. Without your reinforcement, if you leave this place, they might be crushed by the power of the country in a few days. Qing Yi and Yuji responded with an "oh" at this time. They still looked at Luo Fan with their eyes. Luo Fan was helpless under their gaze and said, all right. Since you want to catch up to Gui Shou, I will point out a bright path for you. Thank you, Master. Qing Yi and Yuji were overjoyed and hurriedly bowed to the ground. The joy that emanated from their bodies swept away their previous depression. In the blink of an eye, they looked like two completely different people compared to before. Luo Fan saw that they had already changed so much with just a sentence from him, and he had not come up with any solutions. He knew that this was a sign of their boundless trust in him, and he could not help but feel a little helpless. How could he casually answer them like this? He had no choice but to say, before this, the two of you were not born with intelligence, and the difference in nature had determined that you would never be able to catch up to Gui Shou. But now, the world has changed, and your born Taoism aptitude has given you a chance to surpass the limits of your bodies and catch up to Gui Shou. Qing Yi and Yuji almost could not help but ask Luo Fan what they should do at this time. Fortunately, although they were anxious, they had not lost their rationality and finally resisted this impulse. Luo Fan did not waste time and said directly, the simplest way is to turn around and enter a civilized country, become an ordinary creature in this country, and obtain the identity of the protagonist of this world. Although the starting point will be countless times worse, because of this identity, you will definitely be able to improve after reincarnation without any obstacles. In the end, as long as you have enough time, you will naturally be able to break through the obstacles and reach Gui Shou's current level. Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yuji looked anxious. They wanted Luo Fan to point out the way to catch up to Gui Shou. If they turned around and entered a civilized country, wouldn't they become Gui Shou's creation? How could they accept this? However, I think you will definitely not choose this method. Luo Fan did not wait for them to protest and continued. His words finally made Qing Yi and Yuji heave a sigh of relief. Apart from this simplest method, there's only one other way that can let you break the shackles of your bodies and obtain the same achievements as those born with intelligence. At this point, Luo Fan paused and said, this method is to pass the heavenly tribulation. Pass the heavenly tribulation? Qing Yi and Yuji exclaimed. Chapter 1600. Font color equals red. Squinting eyes face B. That's right. Tribulations are tests from heaven and earth. Those who pass the test will naturally be blessed by heaven and earth and receive great benefits. It's only natural for them to surpass the limits of their own lives, Luo Fan said plainly. Qing Yi and Yuji could not help but tremble when they heard that. Well, Master, the tribulations from heaven and earth are so terrifying. I'm afraid we won't be able to withstand it. Qing Yi bit the bullet and said, since we're going to use the tribulations from heaven and earth to temper ourselves, we naturally can't let the tribulations come without any restrictions like when we're unprepared. We naturally need to use some methods to limit the power of the tribulations. Luo Fan smiled. After saying that, he looked at Qing Yi and Yuji quietly and waited for their decision. In fact, apart from reincarnation, going through the tribulations was indeed the only way for them to surpass the limits of their bodies and finally catch up to Gui Shou. The reason was simple. If they wanted to catch up to Gui Shou and break through the natural shackles that heaven and earth placed on them, they would be challenging the rules of heaven and earth itself. That would obviously trigger a reaction from heaven and earth, and thus cause the tribulations to come. This was similar to the transformation tribulation that Gui Shou triggered when he transformed into a born Taoism aptitude. Under such circumstances, The tribulations that came because of breaking through the limits naturally contained the mystery of allowing living beings to break through their limits. Therefore, if the tribulations could be used to summon the tribulations first, by using the tribulations to temper one's body, one would naturally be able to retain the mystery within and allow one to break through their limits. This was the fundamental principle behind Luo Fan's plan. This principle made the entire process seem simple and clear, but the most difficult part was how to summon the tribulation, as well as how to limit the power of the tribulation. This was to prevent the tribulation from not being able to refine the body, and instead destroying the summoner. Qing Yi and Yu Ji thought for a long time. Finally, they looked at each other, gritted their teeth, and kowtowed to Luo Fan. They said, "Master, please teach us how to summon the tribulations to temper ourselves." For them to say this, Luo Fan was not surprised at all. After all, the two of them could no longer return to their previous muddle-headed state after their intelligence had increased. Especially after witnessing the terrifying creatures that could destroy them with a single thought, it was even more impossible for them to remain content with the status quo. Under such circumstances, they had encountered the method of advancement that Luo Fan had given them. Even if this method was extremely dangerous, they could not give it up, even if it was for that 1 in a million chance. Therefore, as they spoke, he raised his finger and transmitted the technique he had created based on the principles of summoning tribulations into their minds with the help of his finger. At this moment, their eyes flashed with countless runes, as well as the deepest shock. The technique created by Luo Fan was so complicated and mysterious. Even though the two of them already knew the principles behind it, they were still extremely shocked by the level of thinking that Luo Fan revealed. Amidst the shock, Qing Yi and Yu Ji kowtowed to Luo Fan and kept thanking Luo Fan for teaching them the technique. There's no need to be so polite. The faster you cultivate this technique, the better. Don't delay it, Luo Fan said faintly. Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji were even more grateful. They bowed to Luo Fan again. Then, the two of them left the hall that Luo Fan was in. After they left the hall, the two of them directly found a world and entered it. Then, they began to carefully comprehend the mysterious method that Luo Fan had taught them. Both of them had extraordinary wisdom, and the technique that Luo Fan taught them was created according to their situation. Therefore, the two of them comprehended the technique very smoothly. In just a few short days, they had already clearly comprehended all the profundities of this technique. In a daze, they even had an indescribable feeling in their hearts, as if there was a supreme existence somewhere in the world. Moreover, it was constantly brewing some kind of unimaginable destruction, and was about to gush out an inconceivable power to destroy everything. Before this, not only could the two of them not sense its existence, but they also did not know what it was used for. However, after comprehending the technique that Luo Fan taught them, they knew that it was actually the source of all tribulations in the world. In other words, it was the beginning of all tribulations in the world, the source of all tribulations. Of course, they were actually quite clear in their hearts that the origin of tribulations itself might not exist, and what they sensed now was merely a product that was materialized from some abstract existence described in the technique. After clearly sensing the source of tribulations, Qing Yi and Yu Ji knew that they had reached the point where they could use the technique. When they thought about how Gue Shou had already left them far behind, an indescribable fighting spirit surged in their hearts. After discovering that they could already use the technique, how could they still hesitate? Immediately, the two of them stepped out of the world that they were in and appeared outside the world. They appeared above the mountain peak in the center of the civilized country. Then, they looked at each other and saw the indescribable determination in each other's eyes. After that, they did not hesitate. They slowly closed their eyes and slowly activated the technique that Luo Fan taught them. As the technique was being used, an indescribable charm was naturally emitted from the two of them. It was as if they were breaking through their own limits and surpassing the natural shackles of their bodies. Under this charm, the aura from their bodies began to slowly seep out. It began to surge in all directions and gradually formed an indescribable impact on the surrounding void. Under this change, the void above their heads gradually began to change. A cluster of increasingly dense and obvious dark clouds began to rapidly condense. Moreover, within the dark clouds, one could feel the sound of lightning flashing, as if some kind of incomparably terrifying power was brewing within and could strike down at any time. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace, seemed to have sensed something. He opened his eyes, and his gaze penetrated through the layers of barriers. He directly saw the changes happening to Qing, Yi, and Yuji's bodies. Will they be able to break through? At this moment, such a thought directly appeared in his mind. Although he was confident that there wouldn't be any problems with the technique he created, he had never tested it before. Therefore, he didn't know how to use it. Compared to the other techniques he had created, he was the least confident that this technique could succeed. This lack of confidence was only relative to the other techniques he had created. In fact, on an absolute level, he was still quite confident that this technique could succeed. At this moment, there was already a change on Qing, Yi, and Yuji's side. In the void above, within the cluster of clouds, suddenly, two bolts of lightning fiercely struck down from the cluster of clouds, directly bombarding the two of them. The nature of this lightning was so mysterious and incredible. Even though the two of them instinctively gathered their strength to resist, in the end, the lightning still completely ignored their defenses and directly bombarded their heads. Then it directly flowed around their bodies and attacked them, finally making them feel everything about themselves. Even the source of their lives suffered an indescribable impact, causing unimaginable pain. At this moment, both Qing, Yi, and Yuji felt as if their entire bodies were about to collapse and be destroyed. What a powerful tribulation. This thought appeared in their minds almost at the same time. It should be known that the tribulation they had guided was only the most basic and weakest of tribulations. However, this kind of tribulation already made them feel as if they could not bear it. One could imagine how terrifying this tribulation was. However, now that things had already begun, they could no longer afford to regret it. No matter how painful and dangerous it was, they could only forcefully endure it. At this moment, the two of them had completely dispelled all distracting thoughts. They only focused on circulating the technique, trying their best to borrow the power of the technique to guide the power of the tribulations to attack the invisible shackles that existed on their bodies. Just the slightest trace of the tribulation's power was clearly not enough to break through the shackles. Therefore, at this moment, although the shackles were slightly loosened under the impact, they were still there when the power of the lightning was completely exhausted. They were still restraining and shackling them, preventing them from truly transcending and narrowing the gap between them and the Guei Shou in terms of intrinsic quality. However, they had already attacked the shackles, after all. At this moment, an indescribable hope surged in their hearts. After the lightning's power was exhausted, the two of them didn't even have the time to look at each other before they circulated the technique again to summon the tribulation's power above the clouds above them. In an instant, another two lightning bolts blasted down from the clouds and struck their bodies in the blink of an eye. They continued to wreak havoc in their bodies, constantly tempering everything in them, including their life origin. Due to their previous experience, the lightning they guided this time was around twice as large as the first lightning bolt, and the pain they felt was even more intense than before. This kind of pain caused the two of them to once again feel fear and regret. However, the impact of the lightning bolt on the invisible shackles allowed them to see hope again. It allowed them to toss their regret and fear aside. Similarly, the second lightning bolt did not break through the invisible shackles. However, it was still the tribulation's power. Even if it did not pose a threat to the shackles, it still brought them a lot of benefits after passing through it. It allowed their bodies to endure an indescribable tempering. Yes, compared to before, their bodies had improved a little. Their ability to endure the lightning bolts had also increased. And this was obviously great news for the two of them. After they sensed that the lightning still couldn't break through the shackles, they guided even stronger lightning bolts to descend. They continued to refine their bodies and continued to attack the invisible shackles. This process continued and continued. In the blink of an eye, several years had passed. Over the past few years, Qing Yi and Yu Ji had been summoning the lightning to descend at all times, continuously refining their bodies and attacking the invisible shackles from the beginning until now. The lightning bolts had already reached several 100,000. The number of lightning bolts that the two of them had endured had already reached hundreds of thousands. The power of the lightning bolts was extremely weak in the beginning. It had grown to the point where it could completely destroy them in an instant. However, even though it had increased to this point, it could only shake the invisible shackles. At most, it could only greatly loosen the invisible shackles. However, it could not break through the invisible shackles at all. To Qing Yi and Yu Ji, this brought them great pain. It was not just the endless pain that the lightning bolts brought to their bodies. More importantly, the power of the lightning bolts would shake the invisible shackles every time. But in the end, the invisible shackles would return to normal after the power of the lightning bolts was completely exhausted. This brought them even more pain. This feeling was like that of an ordinary person. Clearly, as long as they grabbed this small card, they would be able to win a grand prize of several 100 million yuan. However, someone had placed this card in a place where they could touch it, but could not grab it no matter what they did. It was self-evident how much pain it brought to their hearts. Qing Yi and Yu Ji, who were in the tribulation, did not have a single piece of good flesh on their bodies. The two of them hover in the void like two charred corpses. At this moment, where was their usual beauty and cuteness? Where was their calmness and calmness? The reason for this was very simple. The increase in the power of the tribulation had gradually broken through their bodies' defenses. It was already gradually harming their bodies. In other words, their bodies. They could no longer bear the burden. This only represented one fact, and that was that they had reached their temporary cultivation limit. Their cultivation that had lasted for several years was about to come to an end. At that moment, Qing Yi and Yu Ji both roared out in unwillingness. They summoned a bolt of lightning that was more powerful than any they had seen before from the clouds. The two bolts of lightning were like two sharp swords that descended from the sky and stabbed at the two of them. With a soft swoosh, the two bolts of lightning poured into their heads out of thin air. With a loud bang, their bodies suddenly collapsed and turned into countless tiny fragments that flew in all directions. The two of them suddenly let out shrill screams. Following the change, the indescribable charm and the inconceivable aura that they had exuded had completely disappeared. With the disappearance of the charm and aura, the clouds that existed in the void naturally disappeared as well. The entire sky that had been dark for several years had thus regained its clarity. After the sky regained its clarity for a while, countless tiny fragments quickly gathered in the void. In the blink of an eye, Qing Yi and Yu Ji had condensed in their original positions. The two of them who had condensed looked completely normal. However, they were no longer the charred corpses from before. Instead, they had returned to their original state where they had not been injured at all. They were still as beautiful and cute as before. In the end, we're still not strong enough. Qing Yi sighed. That's right. If our bodies were a little stronger, we might have succeeded this time. Yu Ji also said rather discontentedly. At this moment, Luo Fan's voice suddenly rang in their ears. Why are you so discontented? Do you think that the technique I've created is so crude? Are you thinking that you can master it on your first try? The voice shocked Qing Yi and Yu Ji. The discontentment on their faces suddenly disappeared completely. What replaced it was a kind of awakening from a dream, a kind of sudden realization. That's right. This is only our first time cultivating this technique. Saying that we've just learned it is already an exaggeration. How would we dare to plan on mastering it on our first try? Such thoughts flashed through their minds. After that thought, The two of them could not help but reveal indescribable shame. Qing Yi and Yuji hurriedly bowed towards the hall that Luo Fan was in and said, "Thank you for your advice, master. If not for you, we would have made the mistake of being too impatient. Cultivate well. As long as you persevere, this technique will definitely allow you to break through your shackles and surpass your limits," Luo Fan said plainly. It was due to the various changes that had happened during Qing Yi and Yu Ji's heavenly tribulations. He was completely sure that the method he had created to allow living beings to break through their limits was an absolutely effective method. Yes. Regarding Luo Fan's order, Luo Fan nodded. Qing Yi and Yu Ji naturally agreed without hesitation. After they agreed, Luo Fan naturally shut his mouth and stopped paying attention to them. Instead, he slowly closed his eyes again. He began to continue his cultivation. After Luo Fan's voice disappeared, Qing Yi and Yu Ji did not stay at the place where the heavenly tribulation was held. There was nothing here. It was empty and spacious. Naturally, it was only suitable for the heavenly tribulation, not suitable for them to cultivate here. Each of them turned around and stepped into one of the 30 million worlds they had opened up. When they returned to that world and felt the wonderful and relaxed feeling, the two of them suddenly rejoiced that they had opened up so many worlds. In fact, when I really remember, although the presence of so many worlds was quite a burden for the two of them, they had to first resolve the existence of those worlds before leaving this place. However, it was precisely because of these worlds that they had been able to improve so quickly. It was also because of these worlds that they were able to grow to this level in the end. Without the oppression of these worlds, they might still be at the stage where they were at the very beginning. Although they had intelligence, they had no understanding of the various states of the mortal world. Their use of intelligence would also be at an extremely inferior level. How could they have achieved what they did now? Perhaps, back then, Master placed the fate of these worlds behind us because of this. For a moment, such a thought flashed across their minds. However, if Luo Fan knew about this, he would definitely say that they were thinking too much. It was normal for Qing Yi and Yu Ji to have such a mentality. Most people would think well of someone they respected. Even if it was a seemingly meaningless arrangement or action, they would naturally attach special meaning to it. In particular, when they unconsciously benefited from such an arrangement, they would naturally attribute the credit to the person they respected. Although Qing Yi and Yu Ji were not ordinary mortals, they were also living beings with complete intelligence. Of course, they could not avoid such a mentality. After expressing their admiration for Luo Fan in their hearts in this world, they began to find a place to cultivate. In the past few years, they had cultivated the technique that Luo Fan had taught them. Although they had not broken through their most important goal, which was to break the invisible shackles that had restricted them, they had already obtained boundless benefits from the tribulation. Putting everything else aside, at this moment, their sense of that inexplicable place was already more than 10 times clearer than before. That was because this feeling brought about all sorts of inexplicable divine abilities and inexplicable methods. But because of this, they were also greatly enhanced. Just this alone had already made the two of them several dozen times stronger than before. Not to mention that their bodies and even their life essence had become thousands of times stronger than before after being refined time and time again. The effect of this increase in strength was already quite considerable. When the two of them truly sorted out their gains, their admiration for Luo Fan was even more uncontrollable. Chapter 1601. Just as Qing Yi and Yu Ji were working hard to use the power of the tribulations to refine themselves and improve themselves, in another civilization that was billions of light years away from the civilization, Guizhou was giving pointers to the creature formed by that civilization's national providence. After receiving Luo Fan's pointers and learning about this creature's true essence, he felt that this creature was completely different from before. Originally, the creature he saw in his eyes was clearly a bit strange, its essence blurry, difficult to see through. But now, the situation was completely different. Now that he looked at this creature again, He could tell at a glance that there was a strange existence that was closely related to any of the civilizations that he had passed through in the past. Seeing this clearly, Gue Sho no longer had any doubts about what Luo Fan said about this creature being formed by the national providence of those civilizations. At this moment, the creature was still sitting below Gue Sho, looking at him with an anxious and expectant gaze. Around him, the other living beings that had been enlightened by the turtle lifespan were also looking at him with expressions similar to those of other living beings. When Gue Sho slowly opened his eyes, there seemed to be a strange light shining in all of the creature's eyes. Gue Sho was not surprised by this at all. He just said to the creature formed by the national providence, "I already understand your essence. Next, you will cultivate according to this method. If you succeed in your cultivation, you will definitely obtain great benefits." With that, he pointed. He casually pointed with his finger, and in an instant, boundless information gathered into a ray of spiritual light that directly rushed into the creature's mind, completely fusing with its memories. At this moment, the creature's body trembled, and there seemed to be endless characters and runes flashing in its eyes. Not long after, a look of shock and joy appeared on its face. It directly bowed to Gue Sho and said, "Thank you, Creator, for your help." Gue Sho sighed, raised his hand, and made a gesture. Then, a vast power was generated naturally. He slowly lifted it up. Afterward, Gue Sho said, "No need to be so polite. Cultivate well." The creature naturally could not help but nod. After doing all this, Gue Sho did not stay here any longer. He led the many living beings toward another kingdom that they had yet to visit. The moment they left the country, Gue Sho saw the nation's fate fuse with the creature in an unbelievable way. They saw, in that split second, all living beings within the kingdom naturally produced wisps of extremely illusionary presences that even Gue Sho could only faintly sense, but could not touch or change. These strands of strange existences were like rivers flowing into the sea, flowing into the being formed by the destiny of a nation from far away. They converged inside its body and became a strange existence that was on par with the countless other existences. After that instant, Gue Sho sensed that the relationship between the creature in front of him and the civilized country they had just left had once again become shockingly close. It was as if all changes would affect that civilized country. So that's how it gathers the destiny of the nation. Gue Sho thought to himself. At that moment, the status of the being formed by the destiny of the nation in his heart suddenly began to rise by several levels. It had even surpassed the status of any civilized country. When they arrived at the next civilized country, Gue Sho did not immediately go to the country to eliminate the possible hidden dangers around it, nor did he immediately open up an island to preach. Instead, he directly began to create a world suitable for the cultivation of the being formed by the destiny of the nation. He directly threw the being into it, allowing the destiny of the nation, which had already comprehended the method he had passed on, to enter the world, allowing it to begin the most important cultivation in its life. The being formed by the destiny of the nation had a strong sense of admiration for Gue Sho. It accepted all of Gue Sho's arrangements from the bottom of its heart. After being thrown into this world, it did not show any strange behavior. Instead, it directly began to cultivate according to Gue Sho's plan. For the destiny of the nation, the most important cultivation was to obtain a born Taoism aptitude. As a being formed by the destiny of the nation that was formed by beings with born Taoism aptitude, if it did not have a born Taoism aptitude, how could it be completely compatible with that country? In this world, it slowly circulated its power and began to reconstruct its body from the inside out. It worked hard to change its body from a rough human form to a real born Taoism aptitude. If such a process was done by any other ordinary being in this world, it would definitely cause a reaction from the world. Even if it did not trigger a transformation tribulation, many other strange phenomena would definitely appear. However, the being in front of it was different. The process of its body transforming into a born Taoism aptitude was a natural process. It did not cause any abnormal behavior at all. It was already over. It felt as if the world had been waiting for it to transform into a born Taoism aptitude for a long time. In the end, when it truly transformed into a born Taoism aptitude, it suddenly felt an indescribable feeling. In a trance, it had already understood where its essence was. It knew that it was the destiny of many nations. For a moment, its entire body shone brightly. It did not wait to leave this civilized nation before it absorbed the nation's destiny into its body. It completely integrated with its own life essence. At this moment, the entire civilized nation trembled slightly. Vaguely, it seemed to have become much heavier, as if there was an incomparably stable support beneath the country. This change was directly reflected in the hearts of all the beings in the entire civilized nation. It suddenly gave them an indescribable confidence. This confidence that came out of nowhere changed their every move. Some cultivators even directly obtained tangible benefits because of this change in mentality. They directly broke through the limits of their cultivation realm and stepped into a whole new realm. As for all these changes, Guizhou naturally felt it in his heart. For a moment, he felt extremely fortunate that he had brought along the living beings formed by the nation's destiny. Putting everything else aside, just the fact that it could fuse the nation fate of all the civilized countries together, allowing all the countries to become one, supporting and relying on each other, was already a great benefit. It was of great significance to the new main character of this world. Transforming into a born Taoism aptitude was only the first step in the cultivation of the nation's destiny. Next, using the born Taoism aptitude as the foundation to cultivate was the true main body of cultivation. However, this was already a normal cultivation process. It would be fine as long as it followed the prescribed order. Naturally, there was no need for Guizhou to pay attention to it anymore. Immediately, he began to carry out the procedures that had to be carried out every time he entered a new civilized nation. He sent out many living beings to eliminate the hidden dangers around the nation. At the same time, he began to build islands. He announced the sermon. This was a process that had happened countless times, so there was no need to say anything more. Just like that, another 30,000 years passed. During those 30,000 years, Guizhou was still the same as before, constantly searching the world. He visited the civilized countries that were born in the world and established by the living beings with born Taoism aptitude, passing on the complete and mature way of cultivation. He guided all the cultivators in the civilized nations so that they could understand cultivation and understand the direction to move forward. And now, even though such a long time had passed, he still only walked through a very small part of the world. In terms of the number of nations that he had walked through, there were already hundreds of thousands of them. However, in his senses, he could feel that outside of the range he had walked through, there were still many more civilized nations than the ones he had walked through waiting for him. After such a long time, although there were still thousands of intelligent living beings around him. Among these living beings, there was only one that was the same as 30,000 years ago, and that was the nation's destiny. As for the rest of the living beings, they were all living beings that he had recently enlightened. According to Master, it's not the territory of the big organization ahead. On this day, Guizhou stopped at a certain place with the thousands of creatures and thought to himself. This place was a river. This river could even be called an ocean. What flowed in this river was not any kind of liquid that he had seen before. Instead, it seemed to be an extremely chaotic existence that was similar to a state of chaos. The existence of this vehicle was indescribably violent. It was impossible for any living beings to exist in it. Even Guizhou had to summon the concept of nothingness to protect himself if he wanted to step into it. Only then could he remain unharmed, let alone other living beings. Even if living beings with innate intelligence used the power that was summoned to protect themselves, they would probably be torn apart and devoured by the violent existence flowing in the river. As for why Guizhou knew that there was another region ahead, the reason was even simpler. Over the years, Gue Shou had used the same method to send his consciousness back to the central civilized country to ask Luo Fan for guidance, and he had been guided by Luo Fan. At this moment, Guiyun, who was standing next to Gue Shou, asked curiously, "Creator, why aren't we advancing? Is there any danger ahead?" After spending 30,000 years together day and night, the living beings formed by the nation's destiny had already become extremely close to Gue Shou, and the sense of admiration between them was several times deeper than before. It was because of this that he dared to say such curious words at this time. "It's not dangerous, but it's different ahead from here. I wonder if there'll be any changes in the environment." Gue Shou smiled. At this moment, he had already adjusted his mood, and with a thought, he summoned the concept of nothingness and instantly enveloped all the living beings present. Immediately afterward, he led them forward without hesitation. Although he did not plunge into the river and directly endure the violent and chaotic impact of the river. Originally, there should have been no problem without this concept of nothingness to protect them. However, this river was simply too chaotic and violent. The river's top, bottom, left, right, front, back, and forth could change at any time. In other words, even if they crossed the river's surface before they finally crossed the river's surface could change at any time, changing from above to below at any time. In fact, during the short period of time that Gue Shou had stayed here, the river had already changed several times. Under such circumstances, without the concept of nothingness to protect them, crossing this river with so many living beings, that was simply courting death. Because of this, Gue Shou made such a move at this time. This river was extremely wide, and the moment they walked to the center of the river, loud splashing sounds suddenly came from below. Amidst the loud sounds, the river suddenly moved up and down, and the area that was originally above and outside the river suddenly became inside the river. On the contrary, the area below, which was originally chaotic and violent impact, became the area above the river's surface. The violent river water constantly crashed into everything around it, destroying anything that did not belong to the river water. It directly rushed towards Gue Shou and the others. In the blink of an eye, the concept of nothingness that had appeared around Gue Shou and the others produced countless ripples and fluctuations. But these ripples, these fluctuations, none of them truly broke through the cage of the concept of nothingness. None of them truly harmed Gue Shou. Moreover, they did not harm the thousands of other living beings protected by Gue Shou. This change caused many living beings below the turtle lifespan to reveal expressions of panic. Although these living beings were all transformed by Gue Shou, and the things they had seen were all brought to them by Gue Shou. However, this did not mean that they did not know the danger, nor did it mean that their survival instincts had disappeared. The river in front of them was so strange and violent. How could they not feel the danger contained in it? How could they not know what would happen if they threw themselves into it without concealment? Under such circumstances, seeing these terrifying impacts directly colliding with a place not far from them, seeing that they were about to touch their bodies and be sucked into the river, how could they not feel horrified? With the concept of nothingness as the protection, it was naturally a simple matter to break through this river. Gue Shou controlled this concept of nothingness, disregarding all the changes around him. He just brutally and forcefully attacked. In a short while, he had crossed the incomparably wide river and directly rushed out, arriving at the territory that did not belong to the big organization. At first glance, this place seemed to be no different from the territory of that big organization from before. However, if one were to carefully sense it, one would be able to discover that this world was filled with a faintly discernible, indistinct, and seemingly illusory will. The essence of this kind of will was so advanced that the moment Gue Shou sensed this will, he suddenly had a feeling that he had suddenly returned to the central civilized country and saw Luo Fan with his own eyes. So powerful. Such a thought instantly appeared in Gue Shou's mind. After this thought, he could not help but feel a little uneasy. One had to know that under such a powerful, boundless, and unbelievable willpower, Everything he did seemed to be done right under the other party's nose. If he was not careful, he might violate some taboo and anger the other party. At that time, he would not even know how he died. While feeling uneasy, Gue Sho naturally stopped moving forward. He floated above the void and began to carefully sense and experience in his heart. He wanted to sense and understand the likes and dislikes of that will, and he wanted to understand where the bottom line of this terrifying will was. Unfortunately, this will was simply like heaven's will. It was so illusory. Even though Gue Sho was now so powerful and incredible compared to this will, he was still so weak. At this time, no matter how he tried to sense it, he could not sense anything. This included the likes and dislikes of this will's opinion of him, and this will's bottom line. When he carefully sensed it, what he had before was still the same. What he knew before was still unknown now. What he did not know before was still unknown now. With a slight sigh, Gue Sho finally knew how ridiculous it was to try to guess the plan of that will. He sighed helplessly. In the end, he decided to follow his original plan and began to move toward the location of the civilized country that he had sensed. Since he could not find the likes and dislikes of the other party, there was naturally no need to talk about avoiding or changing. Of course, he would go according to his original style and plan. Regarding Gue Sho's behavior, the creatures that were enlightened by Gue Sho naturally saw the fate of the country and were puzzled. However, their realm was still quite far from the realm where they could sense that incredible will. Even if that will was overwhelming and covered everything in this world, they still could not sense it. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for them to know what Gue Sho was doing. In the nearest civilized country, it was dozens of light years away. Gue Sho led the group of living beings, and it only took them a few dozen breaths to arrive at this place. The moment he arrived, Gue Sho could not help but widen his eyes. He was inexplicably amazed by the scene in this civilized country. In the past, the countries that he had been to were in a weak position, no matter what. Some were besieged by the surrounding creatures, and were about to fall and be destroyed. Some were threatened by the surrounding creatures, and were worshipped almost like slaves in exchange for safety. Even if they were not threatened, those who were not attacked were also living carefully. They had all kinds of means to avoid, and their defenses were set up tightly. They did not dare to be careless. However, the civilized country in front of them was completely different from the civilized countries in the past. In this civilized country, the creatures with natural Taoism aptitude were enslaving countless creatures in this world. For example, now, not far in front of Gue Sho and the others, there was a creature that looked like a wild bull. It carried all kinds of tools on its body, and no one knew how many things it was carrying. It was walking at a moderate pace. On the back of that creature stood a creature with natural Taoism aptitude, and it was waving a long whip to command that creature in high spirits. Apart from this, all kinds of creatures in other places were being commanded by the creatures with natural Taoism aptitude in various ways, and they were doing all kinds of work. All of this made it seem as if the living beings in this civilized country were keeping the numerous natural living beings in captivity. How could this be? Even Gue Sho, who was knowledgeable, could not help but feel puzzled at this time. If it was said that the living beings in this country were indescribably powerful and could even subdue the natural beings in this world, and even the weakest living beings were equivalent to false saints, then he could understand why such a scene would appear. Even if he was extremely curious about how the strength of the living beings in this country had risen to such a level. However, the situation in front of him was clearly not like that. The creatures in this civilized country were similar to the creatures in any of the countries that he had passed by in the past. At most, only the most powerful ones had broken through the limit and entered the false saint level. There was still a long way to go before they could reach the level of being able to enslave all kinds of powerful creatures in this world at will. Therefore, it was obvious that the reason for all of this was definitely not because of their strength at this moment. The creature formed by the nation's destiny beside Gue Sho came forward to report, "Creator, the nation's destiny here seems a little strange. It seems to be mixed with something. Right now, The living being that was formed from the nation's destiny had already become many times stronger than before. Its strength had already reached the false saint level, and it was similar to the kind of living being that was born in this world, a false saint that could easily guide power from an unknown place to descend. After increasing to this level, his perception of any nation's destiny had also reached a level that could not be compared to at the beginning. Presently, he only needed a single command in his heart to naturally gather the karmic luck of a kingdom into his body, no matter which kingdom he went to. Not only did it strengthen his own essence, it was even able to allow the karmic luck that was connected to him to fuse and complement each other to form an inseparable whole.